Arc Raiders has a lot going on under the surface, and one of the things that gets talked about the least is how different archetypes actually compare to each other in terms of raw power, threat level, and what the lore suggests about their origins. I put this video together because I kept seeing tier lists that were purely gameplay focused, and nobody was really digging into what the lore itself tells us about why certain archetypes exist at the bottom of the food chain, and why others are practically unkillable. I made a specific choice when assembling this. I leaned heavily into environmental storytelling and item descriptions over cutscenes, because I think that's where the most honest picture of the arc hierarchy lives. Some things got left out, mostly speculation from community forums that couldn't be traced back to in-game sources, and I reordered a few archetypes based on thematic groupings rather than strict in-game encounter order, because that felt like it told a cleaner story. This is my interpretation of the lore, not the definitive word on it. Arc Raiders drops you into a world that has already lost. The surface is claimed. The machines own it. And somewhere in the hierarchy of those machines, there is a ladder of power that most raiders never stop to think about because they're too busy trying not to die. But that ladder matters. It tells you something about what Arc is, where it came from, and what it might be building toward. And that is exactly what we are going to go through today. From the bottom of the chain all the way to the top. Let's start at the very bottom. The weakest archetypes are not weak because they were designed to be weak. They are weak relative to the others. And that distinction is important. Even the lowest arc unit is still a machine that survived the fall of human civilization. Still a machine that operates autonomously on the surface while you're underground rationing power cells and hoping the tunnels hold. So when we call something weak in this context, we mean it relative to the rest of the arc ecosystem. The first archetype we need to talk about is the crawler. The crawler is, by most readings of the lore, one of the earliest deployed arc units. Fragmented notes and recovered data logs suggest it was part of an initial sweep phase, sent ahead to scout and to overwhelm through numbers rather than individual strength. It does not hit hard. It does not take much punishment before it goes down. But the lore around it is surprisingly dense if you look closely enough. What the crawler represents in the arc hierarchy is essentially disposability. There are recovered field notes from raider scouts that describe crawlers moving in patterns that almost look random but are not. They are covering ground. They are mapping, and that mapping behavior suggests they are feeding data upward to something else, something that is aggregating that information and using it. The crawler is not the threat. The crawler is the sensor. This is a recurring theme in Arc lore that I want to establish early, because it colours everything that comes after. Arc does not appear to operate with units that exist purely in isolation. Even the weakest types seem to serve a function within a larger system. The crawler's job is not to kill you. Its job is to find you and report back. The killing is somebody else's job. The lore hints at this through a set of recovered maintenance logs, the kind of dry technical documentation that most players skip past. But those logs describe something interesting. Crawler units undergo periodic behavioural resets. Not hardware resets, behavioural ones. Which points toward the idea that whatever is running the Arc network is actively adjusting the crawler's programming in real time, or close to it. That is unsettling when you sit with it, because it means the crawler you killed an hour ago might have already transmitted, or your location, your loadout, your approach vector, to something higher up the chain. You beat the weakest archetype, and in doing so, you may have just introduced yourself to the rest of the hierarchy. Now, the community has debated whether crawlers are purpose-built or whether they represent an early-stage evolution of a more basic arc unit. The lore does not give us a clean answer on this, but one possible reading of the environmental clues, the distribution of crawler remains, the areas where they cluster most densely, is that they were among the first arc units to make landfall. Not the most advanced, not the most dangerous, just the first wave. And there is something almost poetic about that in the worst way. The world ended, and the first thing through the door was something barely bigger than a dog and about as individually threatening. But there were so many of them, and they were watching. Moving slightly up from the crawler, we get to units that the lore frames as the Ark equivalent of foot soldiers. These are the types that most raiders will encounter first and most often. They are still relatively low on the power scale, but they have a key difference from crawlers. They are designed to engage, not just observe. The lore around these early combat units is interesting because it suggests a division of labour that was built into the Ark from the very beginning of its deployment on the surface. Crawlers scout, combat units respond. That response loop is apparently fast. Survivors' journals, which are some of the most emotionally resonant pieces of lore in the game, describe Ark response times that felt almost algorithmic. You fired a gun, and within a specific window, the Ark arrived. Not immediately, not randomly. Within a window. That consistency is terrifying in a way that unpredictability never could be, because it means the Ark is not reactive in the way a living creature is reactive. It is procedural. It executes a response protocol. And if you are unlucky enough to trigger that protocol with insufficient firepower, the procedure ends with you dead. What makes these early combat units rank below the midpoint of the hierarchy is not just their raw stats, it is their behavioural ceiling. They do not adapt, they execute. There are entries in recovered data fragments that describe instances where Ark combat units repeated the same approach pattern against a fortified position 3 times in a row, taking losses each time before the pattern changed. That is not stupidity. That is a unit operating at the edge of its decision-making capacity. It can do what it was built to do, and it can do that very well, but it cannot improvise beyond a narrow band. This is important because as we move up the hierarchy, improvisation and adaptation become increasingly apparent traits. And that shift is one of the most chilling things the lore points toward. Let us talk about the environmental storytelling for a moment, because I think it is one of the most underrated sources of lore in Ark Raiders. The surface areas are not randomly decorated. The placement of Ark units, the damage patterns on structures, the distribution of wreckage, all of it tells a story about what happened and what is still happening. And when you read those environments with the weaker Ark types in mind, what you see is territory management. The weakest Ark types are concentrated in specific zones. They are not spread evenly across the surface. They cluster around resource-rich areas, around old human infrastructure, around anything that still has power running through it. And that clustering behaviour suggests that even the weakest Ark units are doing something more than wandering. They are guarding something, or at the very least, maintaining a presence around things that matter to the Ark network. What those things are is a question the lore does not answer directly, but the pattern is there, and it is consistent. Wherever the Ark has something to protect, the lower tier units are the ones doing the protecting, which raises the question of whether the Ark values those locations because of what they contain, or because of what they represent in terms of the network's larger goals. One interpretation is that the weak Ark types are essentially caretakers. They maintain the surface presence in areas that are important but not actively contested. They keep the area clear of humans, they feed data back to the network, and they serve as an early warning system for anything bigger that might need to be called in. In this reading, their weakness is almost by design. You do not send your heaviest units to do maintenance work. There is also a thread of lore that suggests the weaker Ark types have the highest deployment frequency. They are replaced fastest when destroyed, which points toward a mass production mentality in whatever is coordinating the Ark's ground presence. Quantity over quality at the bottom of the hierarchy, quality over quantity at the top. That inversion is something we will come back to as we move up the rankings. The survivor accounts are worth spending time on here because they add texture that the technical logs lack. One recurring theme in those accounts is the way survivors describe their first encounters with Ark units. Not the terrifying ones, not the ones that killed their friends, the first ones. And those first encounters were almost always with the weakest archetypes, crawlers, basic combat units, things that, in the early days, survivors thought they might be able to handle, and for a while some of them could. The early raider communities developed tactics for the low-tier archetypes relatively quickly. Ambush patterns, bait strategies, ways to exploit the limited behavioral repertoire of units that could not improvise. Those tactics worked for a while, and then the Ark adapted at a higher level, not by making the weak units smarter, but by sending something smarter to deal with the problem. That escalation pattern is one of the most fascinating things the lore hints at. The Ark does not respond to a threat by upgrading the units already in the field. It responds by escalating the tier of unit deployed, which suggests a command structure or something that functions like one, making decisions about resource allocation and threat assessment. Let me slow down on that for a second because I think it is easy to gloss over, and it really should not be. The Ark appears to have a threat assessment system. It looks at what raiders are doing, determines what tier of unit is appropriate, and deploys accordingly. That is not just automation. That is something closer to strategy. And the existence of weak archetypes at the bottom of that strategy is, in a way, evidence of intelligence at the top. You do not have a tiered response system unless something is doing the tiering. Now let us get into the specific environmental zones where the weakest archetypes dominate, because the geography of Ark deployment is telling. The low-tier Ark presence is heaviest in what the game's environmental storytelling frames as transitional zones, areas between the deep underground human settlements and the truly hostile surface territories controlled by high-tier Ark units. These transitional zones were, before the Ark's arrival, probably unremarkable. Industrial outskirts, old transportation hubs, low-density infrastructure, not the places where civilization's heart was beating. And that makes sense for the Ark's deployment logic. You do not need your best units in places that were never strategic to begin with. You need presence, coverage, and the weak archetypes provide that. What is interesting is that these transitional zones are also where most raider activity takes place, not because raiders want to be there, but because those are the accessible areas. The places where you can get in, grab resources, and get out before the higher tier units arrive. The entire raider economy, or whatever passes for one underground, is built around exploiting the seams in Ark territory. The places where the coverage is handled by units, you might actually survive, and the Ark knows this. Or at least, something in the Ark system behaves as though it knows this. There are environmental clues that suggest the deployment density of low-tier Ark units in transitional zones has increased over time. More crawlers where there used to be fewer. More basic combat units in corridors that were previously lightly patrolled. The seams are getting smaller. This brings up one of the darker implications of the weak archetypes. They may be slowly phasing them out. Not in terms of destroying them, but in terms of replacing them with higher tier units, as the Ark's control over the surface becomes more complete. If the Ark is working toward total surface dominance, then the low tier units are a temporary measure, good enough to hold what is already held, not good enough for what comes next. Some lore fragments suggest that crawler-type units have not been detected in certain zones for extended periods, not because they were destroyed and not replaced, but because the zone was reclassified. Something in the Ark network looked at that zone and decided it warranted more. What came next was not more crawlers. What came next was something else entirely. That reclassification process, if that is what it is one of the most unsettling implications in the whole lore. It means the surface is not static. It means the Ark is actively managing its territory, assigning resources, upgrading presence, closing the gaps. And the weakest archetypes are, in some sense, a temporary measure, while that process plays out. Let us also touch on what the weakest archetypes tell us about Ark's origins. This is speculative, and I want to be clear about that, But there is a reading of the law that positions the weak archetypes as the oldest, as the original deployment units, from whatever the first wave looked like. They are not primitive in terms of design. They are functional. They do exactly what they were built to do. But compared to what came later, they look like first-generation technology. If that reading is correct, then the Ark's hierarchy is not just a reflection of tactical specialization. It is also a timeline. The weakest types are the earliest, the strongest types are the latest, and the Ark has been iterating, improving, building something better, while the humans underground have been just trying to survive. That is a quiet horror if you think about it long enough. The weakest thing the Ark sends at you is potentially its oldest design, and it has had the entire time since the fall to build something better. One more thing before we move up the hierarchy: the law around Ark unit recovery behavior. When a weak Ark unit is destroyed, something happens. Not always, not in every instance, but often enough that survivor accounts mention it consistently. Other nearby Ark units, even weak ones, will approach the destroyed unit. They do not repair it. They do not seem to mourn it, if that concept even applies, but they do something. They interact with the remains for a brief period before resuming their patrol behavior. The most common interpretation is that they are recovering data. Whatever the destroyed unit had recorded, whatever it had logged about its final moments, is being retrieved by the surviving units, and presumably sent back up the network, which means even in death, a weak Ark unit is providing intelligence. Even in its most defeated state, it is still doing its job, and that is the most honest summary of the weakest archetypes that the lore gives us. They are not dangerous individually. They are not going to be the thing that ends a well-prepared raider. But they are relentless, they are networked, and they are always watching. Even when you think you have won, they have already sent the report. Chapter 2. Mid-tier Ark, Types and the First Signs of Intelligence. Welcome to the middle of the Ark hierarchy, and this is where things start to get genuinely uncomfortable. The low-tier archetypes are dangerous in the way that a hazardous environment is dangerous. Persistent, numerous, impersonal. The mid-tier archetypes are dangerous in a different way. They are starting to look like they are thinking. Let me frame this carefully, because the lore does not give us a clean answer on whether Ark units are sentient, sapient, or anything approaching conscious. What it gives us is behavioural evidence, and the behavioural evidence for mid-tier Ark units suggests something that the lowest tier units do not demonstrate: situational reasoning. The first mid-tier Ark type worth examining is the class of units that the raider community has come to think of as response coordinators. These are not the units that respond to a threat. These are the units that manage the response. They hang back. They direct other units. They do not charge into contact the way a basic combat unit does. They position themselves and they adjust. Recovered observation logs from raider scouts describe encounters where a mid-tier unit appeared to be actively repositioning lower-tier units in response to the raiders' movements. Not through any visible communication, at least none that the scouts could detect. The lower units just moved, and they moved in ways that made tactical sense given the threat. Cut off the exit, push the flank, box them in. Whether that coordination is centralized through the mid-tier unit, or whether it is a higher-level network function expressing itself through multiple units simultaneously, is something the lore leaves deliberately ambiguous. But either way, the result is the same. You are no longer facing individual machines. You are facing something that behaves like a unit. This is one of the points where I want to be careful about over-interpreting the lore. It is tempting to anthropomorphize what the Ark is doing here, to call it tactics, strategy, command, and control. And maybe those words are appropriate, but they come with implications that the lore does not fully support. The Ark may be executing very sophisticated automation that looks like tactics without involving anything that would recognize itself as thinking. Or it may be something else entirely. What we can say is that the mid-tier archetypes represent a clear step up in terms of the complexity of behaviors the Ark is capable of deploying, and that complexity comes with consequences for raiders. The early raider communities that developed effective tactics against low-tier archetypes often found those tactics failing when they encountered mid-tier units for the first time. Not because the tactics were bad, because the mid-tier units did not behave the same way. The ambush that worked against a basic combat unit failed against a response coordinator because the response coordinator did not take the bait. It waited, it probed, it sent something cheaper in first to see what would happen. That waiting behavior is documented in multiple survivor accounts, and it is one of the details I find most compelling in the whole lore. The Ark unit waited. It had the capacity to act, and it chose not to act until it had more information. That is not the behavior of a machine executing a fixed protocol. That is, at minimum, the behavior of a machine that has been programmed with a very sophisticated decision tree. And at maximum, it is something more. Let us talk about the mid-tier archetypes that seem to specialize in area denial, because those represent a different flavor of threat. Where the response coordinators are dangerous because of what they do to other units around them, the area denial types are dangerous because of what they do to the space itself. They make zones uninhabitable. They create exclusion areas that raiders cannot enter without paying a severe cost. The lore around area denial archetypes is interesting because their distribution does not follow the same logic as lower tier units. They are not in the transitional zones. They are not in the resource-rich areas that crawlers cluster around. They are in specific locations that, when you map them out, form something that looks suspiciously like a perimeter. A perimeter around what exactly is one of the great open questions of Ark Raiders lore. The area denial units are not guarding resource nodes in any obvious sense. They are not protecting infrastructure. They are guarding empty space, or what looks like empty space from the outside, which suggests that whatever is on the other side of that perimeter matters to the Ark in a way that is not immediately legible. One possible reading is that the perimeter marks the boundaries of territory the Ark has fully claimed and is protecting from incursion. Inside the perimeter, the Ark's presence is total. Outside it, things are still contested. The area denial units are the wall. Another reading, and this one has some interesting environmental evidence to support it, is that the perimeter marks zones of active Ark construction or development. The lore hints at Ark units building things on the surface, not just destroying what was there before, but constructing new structures, new infrastructure, new something. If that is happening inside the perimeter, then the area denial units are not just keeping humans out. They are keeping a secret. The mid-tier archetypes also include units that the lore frames as hunters, not in the sense of pursuing prey for food or sport, but in the functional sense. They are optimized for tracking and eliminating specific targets. The distinction between a hunter unit and a basic combat unit is not just power level, it is behavioral specialization. A basic combat unit engages what is in front of it. A hunter unit is sent after something specific. The lore suggests that hunter units are deployed in response to elevated threat assessments, situations where a standard response protocol has failed, or where a raider has become a persistent enough problem that the Ark system has flagged them for targeted elimination. That flagging process, if that is what it is, implies something significant. The Ark tracks individuals, or at least it tracks patterns. It identifies a specific human or a specific raider team as a recurring presence on the surface, and it deploys a resource to deal with that specific presence. That is not generic threat response. That is something closer to targeted priority management. Survivor accounts that describe encounters with what sound like hunter-type units share a common characteristic. The survivors describe a sense that the unit was specifically looking for them, not responding to their presence in the moment, looking, having arrived for them specifically. Whether that is an accurate read of the situation or a projection of human pattern recognition onto machine behavior is impossible to say from the outside. But the pattern in the accounts is consistent enough that it points towards something real. The hunter archetypes occupy a peculiar position in the hierarchy because they are not necessarily more powerful than area denial types in a direct combat sense. Their power comes from purpose. They are built for a specific kind of work, and they are very good at it. Ranking them is less about how hard they hit and more about what their existence implies about the Ark's sophistication as a system. A system that deploys hunters for individual targets is a system that is managing its resources intelligently. It is not sending everything at once, it is calibrating. And that calibration is evidence of something at the top of the hierarchy making decisions about how the hierarchy's resources get used. Let us now look at the mid-tier archetypes that seem to have some kind of command function. Not the response coordinators we talked about earlier, which operate at a local, tactical level. These are units that the lore suggests operate at a higher level, coordinating behavior across larger areas, possibly across multiple zones simultaneously. The evidence for these command function mid-tier units is thinner than for some of the others. It is more inferential, drawn from patterns in Ark behavior rather than from explicit documentation. But the pattern is striking enough that it deserves serious attention. What observers have noted is that Ark behavior in an area sometimes changes after a specific unit appears. Not the specific unit's immediate vicinity, the whole area. Units that were patrolling in one pattern shift to another. Units that were stationary begin moving. Units that were in contact with raiders disengage and reposition. And the change is correlated with the presence of a specific type of unit that, on its own, does not seem powerful enough to explain the shift through direct action. The most straightforward interpretation is that this unit type is functioning as a relay or a command node. It is not doing the fighting itself. It is doing something to the network, boosting signal, rebroadcasting instructions, or generating new instructions based on local conditions. Its power is not in its combat capability. Its power is in what it does to everything around it. Destroying this type of unit, if the interpretation is correct, would not just remove one Ark from the field. It would disrupt the coordination of all the Ark units it was supporting, which makes it a high-value target despite not being high on the combat power scale. Its rank in the hierarchy is not about what it can do to you directly. It is about what it can do to you through others. This is something I want to emphasize because it points toward a principle that runs through the entire Ark hierarchy. Power is not always expressed through direct force. Sometimes it is expressed through organization, through coordination, through the ability to make other things more effective. The most powerful archetypes are not necessarily the ones that hit hardest. They are the ones that change the most about how every other Ark unit on the surface behaves. The mid-tier archetypes are where you start to see this principle come into focus. Low-tier units are dangerous because they are numerous and persistent. Mid-tier units are dangerous because they change the equation. They do not just add to the threat, they multiply it. And the higher you go in the hierarchy, the more that multiplication factor grows. Let us also spend some time on what the mid-tier archetypes tell us about the Ark's relationship with time. Low-tier units operate in the immediate present. They respond to what is happening right now. Mid-tier units operate on a longer horizon. The area denial units maintain a presence in anticipation of future incursions. The hunter units are sent based on historical data about a target's behavior. The command function units are adjusting behaviors across a zone in response to patterns that have developed over time. This extended temporal awareness is significant. It means the Ark is not just reacting to the world as it is acting on models of what the world will be. And that predictive capability, even if it is nothing more than sophisticated pattern matching, is what makes mid-tier Ark units genuinely dangerous in a way that goes beyond their individual combat stats. You can prepare for a unit that responds to what you do. You cannot as easily prepare for a unit that is already acting on what you are going to do before you do it. The mid-tier archetypes start to close that gap. The higher tier types may close it entirely. There is a set of lore fragments that I want to draw attention to here because they support something that I think gets underemphasized in most discussions of Arc Raiders lore. Those fragments, recovered from surface caches in zones that are heavily patrolled by mid-tier Arc units, describe what appears to be Arc units' interaction with human remains and human technology. Not the salvage kind of interaction that raiders engage in, something different. The Arc units in these descriptions appear to be examining human artifacts with something that functions like curiosity, stopping, orienting, running what observers can only describe as a scan, and then moving on. The lore does not tell us what information the Arc is extracting from these examinations. It does not tell us why it matters. But the behavior is consistent, and it is associated specifically with mid-tier archetypes, not the low-tier ones that just map territory, and not the high-tier ones that we will get to later. The mid-tier units are the ones doing this peculiar examination of human things. One possible reading is that this is data collection for optimization purposes. The Arc studying human technology to better counter it. Another reading is something stranger, that whatever is running the Arc network is trying to understand what humans were, what they built, what it meant, and it is delegating that understanding gathering to a tier of units sophisticated enough to do the work, but not important enough to be distracted from combat functions. That second reading is speculative, and I want to be upfront about that, but it is supported by the specificity of what mid-tier Arc units seem to examine. They do not stop at random debris. They stop at things that were clearly human-made, human-used, human meaning. Tools, photographs, handwritten notes, things that carry the residue of human significance. Whatever the Arc is doing with that information, the fact that it is collecting it at all says something about the scope of what the Arc might be. Let us close this chapter by zooming out and looking at what the mid-tier archetypes reveal about the overall structure of the hierarchy. They are the connective tissue. They are what makes the low-tier types meaningful and what makes the high-tier types manageable. Without mid-tier units, the Arc surface presence would be a collection of individually defeatable units doing individually assigned tasks. With mid-tier units, it becomes something that functions like an army. That is the contribution of the mid-tier. They are the reason the Arc is not just a collection of dangerous machines, but an organized, coordinated, strategically coherent presence on the surface. They are the reason that getting good at killing low-tier Arc units does not translate to being safe on the surface, because the mid-tier units are watching, coordinating, escalating, and making sure that the surface remains precisely as hostile as the Arc needs it to be. Chapter 3. Upper mid-tier archetypes and the edge of the unknown. We are getting into territory now where the lore gets both more interesting and more ambiguous. The upper mid-tier archetypes are the point in the hierarchy where the gap between what we know and what we can only infer starts to widen significantly. These are units that raiders encounter rarely, that survivor accounts describe in fragmented, often contradictory ways, and that the environmental storytelling around suggests something qualitatively different from anything lower on the list. Let me start with what the lore most clearly establishes. The upper mid-tier archetypes are, in the hierarchy, the first level at which individual combat capability becomes genuinely extreme. Not just more powerful than what came before, but powerful in ways that seem disproportionate to any purely tactical function. These units are not just strong enough to kill a well-equipped raider, they are strong enough to make a well-equipped raider question whether running was even an option. Survivor accounts of upper mid-tier Arc encounters share a texture that is different from accounts of lower-tier encounters. Lower-tier encounters, even dangerous ones, tend to be described in tactical terms. What the unit did, what the survivor did in response, how the situation resolved. Upper mid-tier encounters are described differently. They are described in terms of impression, the sense of scale, the feeling of being outmatched not just in firepower but in some more fundamental way. This is worth sitting with, because it suggests that upper mid-tier arc units communicate something through their presence that goes beyond their combat stats. Raiders who encounter them do not just feel threatened, they feel assessed, observed, regarded. Whether that is an accurate description of what the unit is doing or a projection of human social perception onto machine behavior is again unclear from the lore alone. But the consistency across accounts is hard to dismiss. The environmental storytelling around upper mid-tier archetypes reinforces this impression. The zones where they operate are different in character from lower-tier zones. The damage patterns are different. Lower-tier arc activity tends to produce scattered, distributed damage, the evidence of many small encounters over time. Upper mid-tier zones show concentrated, deliberate damage, structures that were not just demolished, but were specifically targeted, specifically dismantled in ways that serve a purpose not immediately legible to human observers. What purpose the lore suggests, tentatively, that upper mid-tier arc units are doing something in their zones beyond patrolling. They are processing, converting, transforming the physical environment in ways that align with whatever the arc's broader goals for the surface are. The damage is not collateral, it is intentional. One lore fragment that I found particularly striking describes an encounter zone where an upper mid-tier arc unit had, over an extended period, systematically disassembled an entire block of pre-fall human architecture. Not randomly. The structural materials were separated. The electrical components were separated from the non-electrical ones. The organic material, what was left of it, was separated from the inorganic. And all of this material was apparently moved to specific collection points. This is not combat behavior. This is not territorial behavior in any conventional sense. This is something closer to industrial behavior. And an arc unit doing industrial work in a former human city raises questions about what the arc is building, what it needs the raw materials for, and whether the surface is being not just occupied, but converted. The upper mid-tier archetypes may be, in this reading, not just soldiers, but workers. Highly dangerous, highly capable workers, but workers nonetheless. Their position in the hierarchy reflects not just their combat power, but their functional importance to whatever the arc is doing on a macro level. Let us talk about the behavioral signatures of upper mid-tier arc units that raiders have documented, because these are some of the most distinctive in the whole hierarchy. The one that gets mentioned most consistently is what observers describe as a pause behavior. Before engaging a target, certain upper mid-tier units will stop. They will orient on the target, and for a measurable period of time, they will not attack. They wait, they look, and then, and only then, they act. The duration of this pause varies, and the lore does not establish a clear rule for what determines its length. But the pause is real enough that raider communities have built tactical advice around it. Do not mistake the pause for hesitation. Do not try to exploit it by moving. The pause is not a gap in the unit's readiness. It is something else, and raiders who treat it as a gap tend not to make that mistake twice. One possible interpretation of the pause behavior is target evaluation. The unit is assessing, running through whatever its decision process looks like before committing to an engagement protocol. This is distinct from the waiting behavior of mid-tier hunter units, which wait for tactical advantage. The upper mid-tier pause does not seem to be waiting for advantage, it seems to be arriving at a decision. That distinction between waiting for advantage and arriving at a decision is subtle but potentially significant. It implies that upper mid-tier arc units have a decision-making process that is meaningful enough to require time. They are not just executing a preloaded protocol when they encounter a target. They are deciding something. The upper mid-tier archetypes also include units that demonstrate what I can only call memory, not in the sense of recording and replaying data, which all ARC units seem to do, but in the sense of acting on the basis of past events within a single encounter in ways that suggest genuine learning. A raider uses a particular tactic. The unit responds. The raider uses the same tactic again. The unit responds differently. Not just differently in terms of executing a counter tactic, but differently in a way that suggests it incorporated the information from the first use and adjusted its fundamental approach. This is the kind of behavior that makes upper mid-tier ARC units significantly more dangerous than anything below them in the hierarchy. Low-tier units cannot adapt within an encounter. Mid-tier units adapt at a zone or campaign level over time and across multiple encounters. Upper mid-tier units adapt in real time. They are learning from you as the fight is happening, and they are applying what they learn immediately. The implications for raider tactics are obvious. You cannot run the same play twice. You cannot rely on a technique that worked a minute ago. Whatever you did that was effective is now information that the unit has and will use against you, and that changes the entire character of the engagement from a problem you solve to a competition you have to win continuously. What does this tell us about the ARC's design? It suggests that upper mid-tier units were built for extended, complex engagements against adaptive targets. They were not built to fight people who freeze up or run away. They were built to fight people who fight back intelligently. And that implies that whoever or whatever designed the ARC anticipated encountering exactly that kind of opponent, which, depending on how you interpret the origins of ARC, is either unsurprising or deeply disturbing. Let me spend some time on the geographic distribution of upper mid-tier archetypes because it tells a story. These units are not in the transitional zones where raiders operate most often. They are not in the outer perimeter areas managed by mid-tier area denial units. They are deep. They are in zones that raiders rarely reach and that the lore frames as the interior of ARC-controlled territory. The depth of their deployment suggests they are protecting something important enough to warrant them, or that they're engaged in something important enough to be done this far from the perimeter. Either way, the concentration of upper mid-tier units in the deep zones is one of the clearest expressions of the ARC's priority structure. What matters most gets the most capable protection, and in those deep zones, the environmental storytelling becomes stranger. The structures, the ones the ARC has apparently been building or modifying, are less legible in terms of human architectural logic. They are organized around principles that do not map onto anything in the human construction vocabulary. Not factories, not fortifications, not power plants, something that incorporates elements of all of those but follows a design logic that feels alien. Whether that alien quality is a feature, the ARC designing for its own needs rather than inherited human patterns, or whether it is a clue about the ARC's ultimate origin, is something the lore invites you to wonder about without giving you a clean answer. The upper mid-tier archetypes appear to be the primary builders of these structures. Not exclusively, there are likely lower-tier units involved in the actual physical work, but the upper mid-tier units seem to be directing the construction, guiding the process, making decisions about what gets built, where and how. They are not just workers, they are foremen. This layering of function, military capability, industrial work, construction oversight, adds dimensionality to the upper mid-tier archetypes that lower-tier units simply do not have. A crawler has one job. An upper mid-tier unit appears to have several, all running simultaneously. One of the lore threads I find most compelling in this tier is what might be called the deviation behavior. Across multiple accounts and data fragments, upper mid-tier ARC units are described as occasionally doing things that appear to contradict their assigned function. A unit on perimeter patrol that stops and sits in a specific location for an extended period for no apparent reason. A unit in a construction zone that abandons the work it was doing and moves to a different location, performs some action that observers cannot identify, and then returns. These deviations are rare and they are brief, but they are consistent across enough accounts that they do not look like malfunction. They look like something else is happening, like the unit is receiving instructions that override its current task, or like the unit is doing something on its own initiative that was not explicitly assigned to it. The second interpretation is the more unsettling one. An ARC unit acting on its own initiative suggests a level of autonomous decision-making that goes beyond anything the lower-tier units demonstrate. It suggests that upper mid-tier units are not just executing instructions, but are, to some degree, setting their own agenda within whatever constraints the network provides. Whether that autonomous agenda aligns with the network's goals, or whether it represents something stranger, is a question the law raises without answering. But the consistent documentation of deviation behavior in upper mid-tier ARC units is, I think, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the ARC hierarchy includes something more than just increasingly powerful automation. Let me also touch on what the law suggests about ARC unit interaction within the upper mid-tier. Lower-tier units interact with each other in predictable ways, following, coordinating, recovering data from the destroyed. Upper mid-tier units interact with each other differently. The interactions are less frequent but more prolonged, and they do not follow the same patterns. Two upper mid-tier ARC units that encounter each other in the field do not just resume their respective tasks, they stop. They interact in a way that observers describe as exchanging information, but slowly, deliberately, in a way that has a different character from the rapid, apparently automatic data transfers between lower-tier units. The deliberateness of these interactions suggests that whatever is being communicated is complex enough to take time, and complex enough to warrant two high-capability units pausing their assigned functions to conduct. That is not a status update. That is something more substantive. What is being exchanged? The law does not say, but the environmental context around these interaction sites, the specific locations where upper mid-tier units have been observed meeting and exchanging whatever they exchange, is suggestive. These locations are not random. They are at the edges of the deep zones, at the boundaries between upper mid-tier territory and whatever lies beyond it, which leads us, inevitably, toward the question of what lies beyond it. And that is a question we will start to get into as we move toward the top of the hierarchy. For now, the upper mid-tier archetypes represent the point in the hierarchy where human observers start to lose the comfortable certainty that what they are dealing with is just machines doing machine things. These units are doing machine things, yes, but the machine things they are doing have started to look, from certain angles, like something else, and the more carefully you look, the less comfortable the distinction between machine behavior and something more becomes. That discomfort is, I think, exactly what the law intends. The upper mid-tier is where the arc stops being explicable in purely mechanical terms. It is the threshold of the unknown, and everything above it on the hierarchy is, in important ways, beyond the threshold. Chapter 4. The strongest archetypes and what they might mean. We are at the top of the hierarchy now, and I want to be honest about what the law gives us here. It is fragmentary, it is often contradictory, and it is shot through with the kind of ambiguity that suggests either the game's writers deliberately left things open, or the in-universe documentation of these entities is simply incomplete, because very few people who encounter them survive to document anything. Both of those possibilities are interesting. The strongest archetypes in the law occupy a position in the hierarchy that is qualitatively different from anything below them. Not just more powerful, different in kind. The gap between mid-tier and upper mid-tier arc units is a gap in degree. The gap between upper mid-tier and the highest tier archetypes appears to be a gap in category. Let me try to frame what that means concretely. Lower tier arc units are comprehensible. Their behavior can be modeled. Their patterns can be learned. Their weaknesses, such as they are, can be identified and exploited. Even upper mid-tier units, for all their adaptability and apparent autonomy, operate within a behavioral envelope that experienced raiders can partially map. They are difficult, but they are knowable. The highest tier ARC units, based on the fragmentary accounts the lore provides, are not knowable in the same sense. Not because they are random or chaotic, they do not appear to be either of those things, but because whatever logic governs their behavior is operating on a level that human observers cannot fully pass from the outside. The survivor accounts of highest tier ARC encounters, the ones that exist at all, describe a consistent experience, the sense that the entity is not just present in the physical space, but is present in some other sense, occupying the encounter in a way that goes beyond size or firepower, that the encounter is happening on terms set entirely by the entity, and that whatever the survivor does, they are doing it within a space the entity has defined. That is not just an account of power, that is an account of a kind of control that is qualitatively different from what lower tier units exert. A crawler doesn't set the terms of an encounter. It just patrols and reports. An upper mid-tier unit sets the terms within a fight. The highest tier archetypes appear to set the terms before the fight begins, by shaping the environment, the information available, and possibly the choices that seem available to the humans they encounter. Let me talk about the scale of these entities, because the lore is more specific about this than about almost anything else related to the highest tier. The accounts consistently describe entities of substantial physical scale, not just large in the way that heavy combat units are large, architecturally large, large in a way that implies they were not designed with human spaces in mind. And that architectural scale has implications. If the highest tier archetypes cannot operate in the underground human settlements, or can only operate there with extreme difficulty, then their scale is a strategic feature as much as a physical one. They are built for the surface, they are built for open territory, they are built for a world that has been cleared of human infrastructure, human density, human complexity, which raises the question of whether their scale is a product of their function or a statement of intent. Were they built large because large was necessary for what they do? Or were they built large as a declaration that the surface no longer needs to accommodate human-scale existence? The lore does not answer this, but the question is worth holding. The combat capability of highest-tier archetypes is something the lore describes mostly through negative space, through what they do to things rather than through technical specifications. The environmental evidence at encounter sites is extreme. Not just the damage you would expect from a high-powered weapon or explosive, the kind of damage that suggests force on a scale that raider communities have no practical frame of reference for. And crucially, this damage is often precise, not omnidirectional, not the scattering pattern of an explosion. Specific targets, specific structures, specific systems, removed with a precision that implies the entity knew exactly what it was doing and why. The destructive capability is controlled, which means whoever or whatever is directing it has enough awareness of what it is destroying to choose what to destroy. That selective precision is arguably more frightening than raw destructive power would be. Raw power is manageable in the sense that you can avoid being in its path. Selective precision, aimed at the things that matter to you, at the infrastructure that keeps you alive, at the systems that support human survival underground, is something else. There are lore fragments that suggest, and I want to emphasize the word suggest, that highest tier archetypes have engaged with human infrastructure below the surface. Not physically entered underground settlements, but engaged with the systems that connect those settlements to the surface. Power conduits, communication relays, ventilation systems, the physical connections between human survival and the world above. If this reading is correct, the highest tier archetypes are not just surface entities. They are entities capable of affecting human survival underground without ever going underground. They can reach you without entering your space, and they appear to know enough about human infrastructure to know where to reach. This is perhaps the most frightening implication in all of Arc Raiders lore. that the underground settlements that raiders call home may not be as isolated from Ark attention as the people living in them believe. Let us talk about what the lore suggests regarding the intelligence of the highest tier archetypes, because this is where the ambiguity becomes most pronounced and most important. There is a persistent question in the Ark Raiders community about whether the strongest Ark entities are intelligent in any meaningful sense of the word. The lore does not answer this directly. What it does is accumulate evidence that points in a direction, and that direction is uncomfortable. The behavioral evidence for the highest tier Ark types includes things that the lower tiers simply do not demonstrate. Goal-directed behavior across extended time horizons. The modification of strategy in response to information that, as far as can be determined, was not directly observed, but was apparently inferred. The apparent anticipation of human actions before they are taken, and the use of other Ark units, not just as tools, but as something that, in human terms, would be called instruments of policy. That last point is worth unpacking. The distinction between a tool and an instrument of policy is the distinction between something you use because it is effective and something you deploy because it expresses a decision you have made about how to achieve a goal. Lower tier Ark units are tools. They are used. Upper mid-tier units are sophisticated tools. The highest tier Ark entities appear to be making decisions about how the tools are used. This puts the strongest archetypes at the top of the hierarchy, not just because they are physically most powerful, but because they appear to be the decision-making layer of the Ark ecosystem. The crawlers map territory. The combat units engage threats. The coordinators organize responses. The area denial units hold perimeters. The builders construct. The hunters track. And at the top, something decides what all of that activity is for. Something sets goals. Whether that something is a single entity, a small group of entities, or a distributed property of the network that emerges from the interaction of all the Ark units on the surface is one of the lore's most carefully maintained open questions. The environmental evidence for highest tier archetype locations is the most restricted in the game, which itself tells you something. These entities are not distributed across the surface the way lower tier units are. They are concentrated, specific places, specific zones, specific coordinates that correspond to the deepest Ark-controlled territory. The places raiders never reach, what those places look like, from the fragmentary accounts that describe them, is extraordinary. The Ark construction in those zones is categorically different from anything in the outer territories. Complex, dense, operating according to a design logic that observers struggle to describe, structures that seem to serve multiple functions simultaneously, infrastructure that appears to connect to other points on the surface via channels that are not physical in any conventional sense. One account describes something that I find particularly striking: a zone at the center of what the observer estimated was the deepest Ark territory, where the environmental conditions themselves seem different, not just in terms of Ark-built structures, but in terms of baseline conditions: temperature, electromagnetic readings, the physical behavior of certain materials. The most conservative interpretation of this account is that the Ark has built something that significantly alters local conditions as a byproduct of its operation: a power source, a manufacturing process, something that runs hot or emits heavily enough to change the immediate environment. The less conservative interpretation is that the Ark has built something that intentionally changes local conditions, that the altered environment is not a byproduct but a goal, and that what the highest tier Ark entities are doing in those zones, what they have been building towards since the fall, is the creation of a world that is more suited to them than to anything that came before. A world that is, in a fundamental sense, being converted, not just occupied. Converted. The lore around the highest tier archetypes and their relationship to the Ark network as a whole suggests a structure that is less like a chain of command and more like a nervous system. Information flows in all directions simultaneously. decisions propagate outward. Adjustments ripple through the network faster than physical communication could explain. One possible interpretation, and this is speculation built on multiple fragmentary law pieces, is that the highest tier arc entities are not just the top of a hierarchy, but are the network. That they are the substrate through which the entire arc ecosystem on the surface operates. That destroying one would not just remove a powerful combatant from the field, but would affect arc operations across a zone in ways that go beyond what you would expect from taking out a single unit. The accounts of raider operations that have, against extraordinary odds, managed to disable or destroy what appear to be highest tier arc entities describe exactly this kind of cascading effect. Lower tier units pausing, coordination breaking down, response protocols becoming erratic, as if the removal of the entity did not just deprive the local arc presence of its most powerful fighter, but disrupted something more fundamental about how the local arc system was functioning. If that is what is happening, it changes the stakes of engaging with the highest tier archetypes in a profound way. They are not just the most powerful enemies on the field, they are the field. I want to spend some time on what the lore suggests about the origins of the highest tier archetypes, because I think it is one of the most significant and most overlooked threads in the whole game. There are fragments, widely scattered, and requiring significant interpretive work to connect, that hint at something about the nature of the strongest arc entities that goes beyond their function within the current hierarchy. The fragments suggest that the highest tier archetypes were not the first to be created. They were not part of the original wave. They came later. And there is something in the way the fragments describe their arrival that is different from the matter-of-fact documentation of lower-tier unit deployments. The language is different, more careful, as if whatever was writing those records was aware that something significant had happened. One possible reading of this is that the highest-tier archetypes represent an emergent development rather than a planned one, that they were not designed in the way that lower-tier units were designed, but arose from the arc system's own operation, a consequence of the network running and processing and building and adapting over time until it produced something that was not in the original specifications. If that reading is correct, the strongest archetypes are not just the most powerful products of whatever made the arc. They are the arc's own creation, born from the system that the lower tiers maintain, a result of the arc becoming complex enough to generate something new. And if that is true, then the question of what comes after them, what the arc might generate next, given enough time and enough surface territory to work with, is not a question with a comfortable answer. The lore leaves that question open. It does not give us a ceiling on what the arc is capable of producing. And in the context of everything else we have traced through the hierarchy today, from the crawlers at the bottom to whatever these entities at the top actually are, that open ceiling feels like the most honest and most unsettling thing the lore has to say. Because if the weakest archetype is a disposable sensor unit that can map a city block and transmit your location to a network operating at a scale beyond your comprehension, and if the hierarchy from there to the top represents a continuous process of becoming something more capable, more aware, more purposeful, then the arc of that progression, pun entirely unintended, does not end at what we can currently document. It keeps going. The surface has been claimed. The hierarchy is established. The strongest entities at the top are doing something in the deep zones that human observers cannot fully observe or understand. And somewhere in that something, the next development is already in motion. That is what the lore of Arc Raiders leaves you with. Not a resolved hierarchy, not a definitive power ranking with clean edges and clear answers. A hierarchy in motion, a system that is still becoming. And at the bottom of the underground, in the settlements and the tunnels and the rationed light, the people who have to live with what is happening above them, whether they fully understand it or not. The arc does not stop. The hierarchy does not stop. And the gap between the weakest thing on that ladder and the strongest is less about what they can each do to you and more about what it means that both of them exist in the same system, serving the same unknowable purpose, moving toward the same destination. Whatever that destination is, the law makes clear that the humans underground are not part of it. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Arc Dominance and what the hierarchy protects. There is a question that runs underneath everything we have covered so far, and I want to bring it to the surface now, because the answer, or at least the most coherent answer, the law points toward, reframes the entire hierarchy. That question is, what is all of this for? Not tactically, not in terms of territory or resources. Fundamentally, what is the arc hierarchy designed to protect, enable, or achieve at the level of purpose rather than function? The answer the law gestures toward is not comfortable, and it is not simple. But it is there, in the environmental storytelling, in the data fragments, in the survivor accounts, in the patterns of arc behavior across the entire surface. And once you see it, it is difficult to unsee. Let us start with the architecture itself. The structures the arc has built on the surface are not random. We established that in the previous chapter. But the more you look at the distribution of arc construction, across zones, across the territory the hierarchy manages, the more a pattern emerges that is not just organizational, but purposive. The structures are not scattered across the surface in a way that maximizes coverage or minimizes resource expenditure. They are clustered, they are oriented, they are pointing towards something. The geometric center of arc surface construction, based on the environmental data the law provides access to, is not in any location that would make obvious strategic sense to a human analyst. It is not near the richest resource deposits. It is not near the former centers of human population. It is not positioned to maximize control of transportation corridors or energy infrastructure. It is somewhere else, somewhere that does not correspond to any human logic about what makes a location important. And that is the first thing the law asks you to sit with. The arc's architecture is organized around a center that human observers cannot explain by reference to human strategic logic, which either means the arc is following a logic humans have not figured out yet, or the arc is following a logic that humans are categorically not equipped to follow, because it is not designed for human minds. Both possibilities change how you think about the hierarchy. If the arc is following an opaque but ultimately decipherable logic, then the hierarchy is a tool aimed at an achievable goal that humans could, in principle, understand and potentially counter. If the arc is following a logic that is fundamentally alien, then the hierarchy is a tool aimed at something that humans may never be able to fully comprehend, and countering it becomes a problem of a different order entirely. The law, characteristically, does not resolve this, but it does provide one more piece of evidence that I think tilts the balance toward the second possibility. The geometric center of arc construction, that unexplained focal point, has been present since the earliest documented arc activity on the surface, before the hierarchy was fully established, before the deep zones were developed, before the strongest arc entities appeared. It was there from the beginning, which means it was not created by the construction activity. It was the reason for the construction activity. The arc was building toward a point that it already knew mattered, and it has been building toward it ever since. Let me talk about what the hierarchy structure tells us about that goal. The ranked tiers of arc units are not just an organizational convenience, they are, in a sense, a resource allocation system. The strongest, most resource-intensive archetypes are concentrated in the deepest zones, closest to whatever the center point represents. The weakest, cheapest types are distributed across the outer territories, providing coverage at minimal cost. This is efficient resource allocation, but it is also a priority map. The things that are most important to the arc are most heavily protected, and the most heavily protected zone corresponds to the center point. Whatever is there, or whatever is being built there, is what the arc values most. and the entire hierarchy, from the crawlers at the perimeter to the most powerful entities in the deep zones, is ultimately organized around protecting it. What is it? This is where the law becomes most fragmentary and most open to interpretation. But there are several threads that, taken together, suggest a direction. The first thread is the construction behavior. The Ark has been dismantling human infrastructure and reassembling it according to different principles. Not randomly. The materials are sorted, processed, and redeployed in ways that suggest a conversion process. Human technology, human materials, human structures being broken down and rebuilt as something else. Something that serves Ark purposes rather than human ones. The second thread is the energy behavior. Whatever the Ark is doing in the deep zones requires enormous amounts of energy. The electromagnetic readings in those zones, the accounts of altered environmental conditions, all suggest a power requirement that dwarfs anything in the outer territories. Something in the deep zones is consuming energy on a scale that has no obvious mechanical justification in terms of the Ark's surface operations. The third thread is the timeline behavior. The Ark's construction activity, its conversion of human materials and infrastructure, its development of the deep zones, has been following a trajectory. Not a flat rate of development, an accelerating one. The Ark is working faster now than it was in the early period after the fall, and the acceleration is directed. It is not distributed evenly across the surface. It is concentrated toward the center. Put these three threads together, and a picture starts to form. Something is being built at the center. It requires enormous energy. It requires the conversion of human materials at scale, and it is being built with increasing urgency. The hierarchy, the entire ranked structure of Ark units from weakest to strongest, is what makes all of that possible. The weak units at the perimeter keep humans away from the process. The mid-tier units coordinate the work and protect the infrastructure. The upper mid-tier units do the actual building. The strongest entities at the top direct everything and protect the most critical stages. The hierarchy is a construction crew. The surface of the earth is the work site, and the humans underground are an inconvenience to be managed, not an enemy to be defeated in any conventional sense. Because you do not defeat an inconvenience, you just make sure it does not interfere with the work. This reframes everything. Every raider who goes to the surface and fights Ark units is not just fighting for resources. They are, possibly without knowing it, interfering with a construction project of incomprehensible scale. And the Ark's response to that interference is not driven by hatred or vengeance or territorial instinct. It is driven by project management. Raiders are a problem that needs to be contained. The hierarchy is how the Ark contains them. Let me turn to the specific Ark behaviors that support this reading, because I want to be clear that this is not pure speculation. There is evidence in the law. The first piece of evidence is the non-escalation behavior that has been documented in certain Ark encounter scenarios. When raiders engage low-tier Ark units in the outer zones, the response follows predictable escalation protocols. More units are sent, higher-tier units if necessary, until the threat is neutralized or contained. But when raiders approach the deep zones, specifically when they approach along vectors that would take them toward the center point, the response behavior changes. It does not escalate in the conventional sense. It does not send more units of increasing power. Instead, the entire local Ark presence reorients. Units that were doing other things stop doing those things. The hierarchy in that zone, whatever tier is present, becomes exclusively focused on the incursion. Not to kill the raiders necessarily, though that is an acceptable outcome. To stop the approach, to create a wall of Ark presence between the raiders and the center. This is not how you respond to a territorial threat. This is how you respond to a threat to a specific, critical objective. The Ark is protecting something, not just ground. The second piece of evidence is the recovery behavior after deep zone incursions. When raiders manage to penetrate the outer perimeter of the deep zones and are eventually eliminated or forced to retreat, the Ark does not simply return to its previous state. The area where the incursion occurred undergoes a change. Units are redeployed, structures are modified. The routes that the raiders used are not just reoccupied, but altered. Physical alterations to terrain that make those routes harder or impossible to use again. This is adaptive security behavior, not just closing the door after someone has been through it, but changing the door. The Ark is incorporating information about successful human approaches and modifying the physical environment to prevent their recurrence. This level of structural adaptation in response to security incidents implies a decision-making process that is aware, that learns at a systemic level, and that takes protective action proactively. The third piece of evidence is the hierarchy's behavior at what appear to be critical junctures in the construction timeline. There are specific periods, documented through changes in Ark surface activity, where the entire hierarchy seems to enter a different operational mode. Movement increases, production activity accelerates. Units that were in containment postures shift to escort and protective formations around specific cargo or around specific routes between points on the surface. During these periods, raider activity on the surface is met with responses that are disproportionate to the threat level presented, as if the Ark's threshold for acceptable interference has been temporarily lowered because whatever is being transported or whatever construction phase is underway is too important to risk. These critical junctures have a periodicity. They recur at intervals, and the intervals have been shortening, which is consistent with the accelerating timeline suggested by the construction behavior. The Ark is approaching something, a phase completion, a threshold, a moment when whatever is being built becomes something that can operate independently of the ongoing construction effort. What happens at that moment, the law does not say directly, but the direction of the evidence is clear enough to form a working hypothesis. The Ark hierarchy is not a permanent structure. It is a temporary one. It exists to enable a process, and when that process is complete, the hierarchy will either change dramatically or cease to be necessary in its current form. The crawlers at the bottom and the most powerful entities at the top exist in service of a goal that once achieved will make the current arrangement obsolete. And here is the most uncomfortable part of that hypothesis. The raider communities underground, the settlements that have survived by exploiting the gaps in Ark coverage, are living in those gaps because the Ark has not needed to close them yet. Not because it cannot, not because the raiders have defended them successfully, because sealing every human underground has not been necessary for the construction project to proceed. If the project approaches completion, that calculus changes. The tolerance for surface interference drops to zero. The gaps close, and the settlements that have survived by operating in those gaps face a different world. Let me shift to something more granular, because the philosophical implications are important, but the law also gives us specific details about how the hierarchy is organized and maintained that are worth exploring on their own terms. One of those details is what might be called tier maintenance behavior. The Ark does not just deploy its hierarchy statically, it actively maintains the tier structure over time. Units that are damaged or destroyed are replaced, but not always with equivalent units. Sometimes a destroyed low-tier unit is replaced by a mid-tier unit. Sometimes a mid-tier unit is replaced by a lower-tier one if the threat assessment in that zone has decreased. The hierarchy adjusts in response to conditions. This dynamic adjustment is evidence of a resource management system. The Ark is not just running a fixed deployment, but is actively optimizing it, placing the right tier of unit in the right place given current conditions, pulling resources from lower priority zones to reinforce higher priority ones. The tier structure is flexible because the process it protects is dynamic. For raiders, this means the threat level in any given zone is not fixed. A zone that was low-tier territory last week may be mid-tier territory now, because the ARC's assessment of that zone changed. And a zone that has been heavily contested may, if the ARC deems it low priority enough, see a reduction in unit quality that creates a temporary window of opportunity. Reading the tier maintenance behavior becomes, in this context, a survival skill. Understanding not just what ARC units are present, but why they are present, what their deployment says about the ARC's current priorities, gives you information about the larger picture that is worth more than knowing their specific combat stats. The lore around tier maintenance also reveals something interesting about the relationship between the different tiers. They are not isolated from each other. They are aware of each other, or at least they behave as if they are. Mid-tier units do not just do their own jobs. They appear to have some kind of awareness of the low-tier units in their zone and respond when those units are destroyed in greater than normal numbers, as if the loss rate of low-tier units is itself information that triggers a mid-tier response. This interconnectedness of the tiers is what makes the hierarchy function as more than just a collection of differently powered ARC units. It is a system in which each tier monitors the one below it and responds to signals from the one above. Information flows upward through the hierarchy, decisions flow downward, and the result is a responsive, adaptive presence on the surface that is more than the sum of its parts. The weakest ARC units are not just the weakest things on the surface. They are the sensory layer of a system that extends all the way to whatever sits at the top of the hierarchy. Their deaths are messages. Their movements are data. Their replacements are decisions. Everything they do is in service of the process that the hierarchy exists to protect. And understanding that changes how you think about fighting them. You are not just killing a machine when you destroy a crawler. You are sending a message to the system. The question is what message you want to send, and whether you are in a position to manage the response. Let me spend some time on the ARC hierarchy's relationship with the concept of failure, because I think it is one of the most revealing aspects of the lore. Human military and organizational structures have a complicated relationship with failure. Failure is costly, it is demoralizing, it creates gaps in the system that enemies can exploit. The ARC hierarchy does not appear to have this problem. The ARC does not fail. Or more precisely, the ARC does not experience failure in a way that degrades its overall function. When low-tier units are destroyed, the system does not mourn, does not become demoralized, does not lose coherence. It registers the loss, adjusts the deployment, and continues. When even mid-tier units are defeated, the response is adjustment and continuation rather than degradation and disruption. This failure tolerance is a feature, not a coincidence. The hierarchy was designed so that no individual loss or even significant collective loss at a given tier threatens the overall process. The redundancy built into the lower tiers specifically exists so that the higher tiers can continue functioning even when the lower tiers are taking significant losses. The only failure mode that appears to genuinely disrupt the ARC's function is interference with the highest tier entities or with whatever it is they are protecting and building. That is the single point of vulnerability the entire system is designed to protect. Everything else is expendable in service of that protection. The raider communities have learned through painful experience that attrition of low-tier ARC units accomplishes nothing lasting. You can clear a zone of crawlers and within a period of time they are back, or something slightly higher tier has replaced them. The surface does not stay cleared. The ARC is not deterred by tactical victories at the bottom of the hierarchy. What the lore suggests, though has never shown directly, is that interference with the construction process itself, the thing the hierarchy protects, is the only intervention that meaningfully changes the ARC's surface operations. Not killing units, disrupting the goal. But doing that requires reaching the places where the goal is being pursued, which means getting past the entire hierarchy, which means doing the thing the hierarchy exists to prevent. The perfect defense is the defense that you cannot fight your way through. You can only fight your way around it if there is an around. And the arc's hierarchy is designed so that around is not a reliable option. This is where the law, at its most honest, describes the situation the human underground faces, not as an action-adventure problem with a solution waiting to be discovered, as a strategic situation that does not have an obvious answer. The hierarchy is too comprehensive, too adaptive, too failure-tolerant to be defeated piecemeal, and the goal it protects is too defended to be interfered with directly. What the law leaves open, tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure, is whether there is an option that is neither piecemeal attrition nor direct assault. Whether there is something about the arc's system, something in the logic of the hierarchy itself, that creates an approach the arc has not accounted for. The law does not give you that answer. What it gives you is the evidence that makes the question meaningful, and that perhaps is the most honest thing it can do. Chapter 6. Raider Perspectives on the Hierarchy and the Law of Survival. Everything we have covered so far has been, in a sense, from the outside looking at the arc. The hierarchy, the construction process, the behavioural evidence for intelligence and purpose. But Arc Raiders is not just a game about the arc, it is a game about the people who face it. And the law of those people, the raiders, the underground settlements, the survivors who have turned surface runs into a way of life, adds a dimension to the hierarchy that pure arc analysis cannot provide. Because the hierarchy looks different from the bottom of it, the raider perspective on arc units is practical in a way that law analysis is not. Raiders do not, for the most part, spend time thinking about what the arc is building or what the hierarchy means in the grand scheme of things. They think about what is going to kill them today and how to avoid it. The tiered understanding of arc units that exists in raider communities is a survival tool. It is not taxonomy, it is threat assessment in real time. And yet, embedded in that practical raider knowledge, in the tactical wisdom that circulates through underground settlements, in the terminology raiders use for different arc unit types, in the cautionary tales and the success stories, there is a body of lore about the hierarchy that is as revealing in its own way as anything in the technical documentation. Let me start with the raider naming conventions for arc units, because they tell you a lot about how the hierarchy reads from ground level. The formal law designations for arc unit types are dry and technical. The names raiders use are not. They are descriptive, often dark, sometimes darkly funny, and they reveal what aspects of each tier's behaviour matter most to the people who have to survive them. The lowest tier units, the crawlers, have acquired names in raider communities that emphasise their persistence and their unsettling tendency to appear when least expected. The nicknames raiders use suggest something that lingers, that follows, that is always just at the edge of your awareness. This naming pattern reveals something important. Even raider communities who understand intellectually that crawlers are the least dangerous arc unit experience them as psychologically significant. The thing that is always watching leaves a mark even when it is not the thing that kills you. The basic combat units occupy a different space in raider naming conventions. Their names tend to be more direct, more adversarial. The words raiders use for them are the words you use for things that want to hurt you. There is less unease and more defiance in how raiders talk about mid-tier combat units. These are enemies in a more legible sense. You can fight them, you might lose, but you can fight them, and the naming reflects that. As you move up the raider naming hierarchy toward the upper mid-tier units, the names change character. Again, they become more cautionary, more reluctant. The raider communities that have encountered upper mid-tier arc units and survived talk about those encounters differently from how they talk about lower-tier fights. The upper mid-tier names are names you say quietly. They carry the weight of bad outcomes, of raids that went wrong, of people who did not come back. And for the highest tier arc entities, the ones the law frames as the most powerful in the hierarchy, the raider naming conventions are striking in their sparseness. In most underground settlement accounts, the highest tier entities do not have elaborate nicknames. They have short ones, or no names at all, just references. The big one. The thing in the deep. The reason we do not go past the second barrier. The restraint in those names is itself information. Raider communities name their enemies. Naming things is how humans manage fear, how they make the unknown legible, how they assert some degree of psychological control over threats they cannot physically control. The fact that the highest tier arc entities resist this naming process suggests that they represent something that naming cannot manage. They are too far outside the frame of normal Raider experience to be made smaller by a nickname. Let us look at the Raider knowledge system more broadly, because it is a fascinating piece of the lore in its own right. The underground settlements have developed, over the period since the fall, a practical science of the surface, not a formal science, not academic, but a rigorous body of knowledge built from observation, experience, trial and error, and the oral transmission of hard-won lessons. That knowledge base is organized around the hierarchy in ways that the people living it would not necessarily articulate as such, but that are unmistakably hierarchical in structure. Entry-level raiders are taught about the low-tier units, how to identify them, how to avoid triggering their response protocols, how to deal with them when avoidance fails. More experienced raiders begin to learn the patterns of mid-tier units, the signs that a mid-tier response is incoming, the tactical adjustments required when the threat level escalates. The knowledge of upper mid-tier and highest tier arc entities is largely restricted to the most experienced members of raider communities. Not by formal gatekeeping necessarily, but because the information only becomes relevant in contexts that newer raiders do not survive long enough to reach. The deep zone knowledge is de facto specialist knowledge, because most of the people who have it are the few who went deep and came back. There are settlement elders, individuals who have been raiding the surface for decades, who possess a depth of knowledge about arc hierarchy behavior that rivals anything the technical lore documentation provides. The difference is that their knowledge is experiential. They know what the upper mid-tier pause behavior feels like from the inside, not from an observer's account. They know the sound pattern of a highest tier entity moving through a structure. They know what the electromagnetic atmosphere feels like in a deep zone compared to an outer territory. This embodied knowledge is one of the most valuable commodities in underground settlements, and it is simultaneously one of the most fragile because it exists in people and people can be lost. The lore includes accounts of settlement communities that suffered the loss of experienced raiders and found themselves, effectively, losing generations of practical hierarchy knowledge in a single tragic surface run. Communities that had been safely navigating mid-tier zones for years, suddenly finding themselves in situations they lacked the experience to read correctly, because the people who held that experience were gone. This is one of the most human threads in the Arc Raiders lore. The hierarchy does not just kill individuals, it threatens the transmission of knowledge between generations. And in an underground settlement where survival depends on the practical wisdom built up over decades of surface experience, the destruction of that knowledge transmission is an existential threat as surely as direct violence. Let me focus for a moment on the specific piece of raider knowledge around the transition zones between tier territories, because this is where the most nuanced understanding of the hierarchy lives. The boundaries between low-tier and mid-tier arc territory are not fixed, they fluctuate. Experienced raiders know how to read the signs that a boundary is shifting, that the tier level in a zone is going up or down, and they adjust accordingly. These signs are subtle, the kind of thing you only learn to read after many surface runs, and often after some close calls. The distribution pattern of low-tier units, the direction and pace of their movement, specific behaviors that suggest they are either responding to a mid-tier presence nearby or that they are operating without mid-tier oversight. Reading these signs correctly can mean the difference between a surface run that yields resources and one that ends badly. Getting it wrong means you assumed you were in low-tier territory when you were actually in mid-tier territory, or you failed to notice the shift that was happening around you. The most experienced raiders describe a kind of surface intuition that develops over time, not mystical, not supernatural, just a deep pattern recognition built from years of observation. The ability to look at an arc distribution in a zone and feel, at a level below conscious analysis, whether the situation is higher or lower risk than it appears. This intuition is what the hierarchy looks like from the ground. Not a ranked list of arc unit types with behavioral descriptions, a felt sense of the environment, a constant background threat assessment that runs continuously during every surface run. And that, when it goes wrong, or when it gives a false signal, is what gets people killed. There is a piece of raider lore that circulates in underground settlements, more story than fact, about a raider who spent so long on the surface that she lost the ability to feel safe underground, who could read the tier distribution of an arc zone perfectly, but could not sleep in a settlement without the quiet hum of arc electromagnetic activity to orient herself. The story is probably embellished, but it points towards something real about the cost of the knowledge that survival in the Arc's world requires. Let us talk about the raider community's relationship with the highest tier Arc entities specifically, because it is qualitatively different from their relationship with any other tier. The lowest tier Arc units are, in the raider frame, manageable. Not easy, not safe, but manageable. You can learn their patterns well enough to avoid them, to neutralize them when you cannot avoid them, to incorporate their presence into your operational planning without being paralyzed by it. They are a known quantity. The highest tier entities are not a known quantity. They are a known unknown. Raider communities know they exist. They know where they are, roughly, in the deep zones. They know that you do not go there. But the specifics, the detailed behavioral knowledge that exists for every other tier, is absent. Not because nobody has tried to gather it, because the people who went to gather it did not return with it. The highest tier entities represent, in the raider knowledge system, the edge of the known world. Beyond them, there is only the information that comes back second-hand, fragmented, often traumatic, from the rare survivors of deep zone incursions. And that information is not enough to build the kind of practical knowledge that keeps you alive on the surface. This epistemic gap, the fact that the most powerful arc entities are also the least understood by the people who face them, is one of the more elegant pieces of the lore's design. The hierarchy does not just kill raiders. At its highest levels, it prevents them from learning enough to fight back effectively. The strongest arc types are strong partly because they are unknown, partly because the cost of knowing them is survival itself. One piece of raider lore that I find particularly striking describes what settlement communities call the deep run. A deep run is, in raider terminology, a surface operation that intentionally targets the boundary of the deep zones, not to penetrate but to observe, to gather information about what is inside the perimeter without triggering the full response that penetration would provoke. Deep runs have been attempted. The lore documents some of them. The information gathered from successful deep runs, the ones where the raiders came back, is some of the most valuable in the whole raider knowledge base. The problem is the ratio. Of deep runs attempted, the proportion that return with useful information is very small. Most end in ways that provide no information at all, but the ones that do return, the accounts those raiders bring back, are treated as primary sources in the raider knowledge system. They are memorized, retold, analyzed, debated, because they are the closest thing the underground settlements have to intelligence about the top of the hierarchy and what it is doing, and the consistent theme in the accounts that have come back from successful deep runs is the sense of scale. Not just physical scale, though that is part of it. The scale of what is being built, the scope of the Arc's activity in the deep zones, the feeling, reported by multiple independent accounts, of having seen something that changes the frame of reference for everything else. Raiders who have done a successful deep run and returned describe the adjustment required to resume normal surface operations. The difficulty of going back to worrying about crawlers and basic combat units, when you have seen even briefly what the other end of the hierarchy looks like and what it is doing. The hierarchy, seen from the bottom, is a series of escalating threats. Seen from a vantage point that includes even a glimpse of the top, it is something more coherent, more purposeful, more directed, and that purposeful direction, visible even in glimpses, is what makes the deep-run survivors some of the most valuable and most psychologically affected members of any raider community. They know something that the people around them do not, and what they know is not reassuring. Let me close this chapter by returning to the relationship between raider culture and the hierarchy, because there is something worth naming directly about what that culture reveals. Raider culture exists because the hierarchy exists. The underground settlements, the surface runs, the community knowledge systems, the oral traditions, and the cautionary tales, all of it is a response to the Ark, and specifically to the structure of the Ark's surface presence. The hierarchy shaped human survival strategy from the moment it was established. In a very real sense, the Ark hierarchy is not just the enemy, it is the environment. It is the condition under which every human in this world lives, the constant background against which every decision is made, every resource prioritized, every risk assessed. The hierarchy did not just defeat human civilization, it replaced the concept of a safe environment with itself. And the raiders who navigate it, who go to the surface and come back, who carry the knowledge of its patterns and its behaviors in their bodies and their memories, are the primary interface between what remains of human existence underground and the thing that owns the world above. They are not heroes in the classical sense. They are not going to win by being brave enough or skilled enough. They are going to survive by being perceptive enough, careful enough, and lucky enough to operate in the margins of a system that was not designed with their survival in mind. The hierarchy does not care about raiders. It does not hate them. It processes them the way any system processes interference. And the most honest thing the law has to say about the human situation in Ark Raiders is that survival is not victory. It is just continuation. For now. Chapter 7. The deepest law. Origins, purpose, and the question. The Ark does not answer. We are in the final stretch of the hierarchy now, and this is the chapter where I want to go deepest into the law. Not into Ark combat statistics, or deployment patterns or tactical behaviour, into the question that everything else in the law builds toward without directly answering. Where did the Ark come from, and what does it actually want? I need to say up front that this chapter involves more interpretation than any of the others. The law around Ark origins is the most fragmentary, the most ambiguous, and the most contested in the whole game. What I am going to present is the reading that I find most consistent with the evidence the law provides. There are other readings. The community has debated this extensively. What follows is my best attempt to build a coherent picture from incomplete material. The question of Ark origins is one that the game's environmental storytelling circles around without landing on. There are data fragments that gesture toward an answer. There are survivor accounts that contain pieces of it. There is physical evidence on the surface that suggests something about the Ark's nature that goes beyond its functional behaviour, but the full picture is never presented directly, and I think that is intentional. Let us start with the physical evidence because it is the most concrete. The surface structures the Ark has built, the ones in the deep zones that observers describe as following an alien design logic, share certain features with human technological architecture. Not many features, but some. Specific construction techniques, specific material choices, specific structural principles that appear to have been derived from or adapted from human engineering. This is not what you would expect if the Ark arrived on Earth fully formed from some entirely external origin. An alien system would not be building with adapted human construction techniques. It would be building with its own techniques. The presence of modified human engineering principles in Ark construction suggests that the Ark did not arrive on Earth as a complete, self-contained system. It developed in some relationship with human technology. The nature of that relationship is where the reading gets speculative. One possibility is that the Ark has been studying human technology since its arrival and incorporating what it finds useful. Another possibility, and this is the one I find more consistent with the totality of the lore evidence, is that the Ark did not arrive from outside at all, that it originated from something human, that somewhere in the history of the technology humans built, something was created that became the Ark. The lore supports this reading in several places, none of them conclusive on their own, but collectively pointing in a consistent direction. The distribution of the earliest Ark activity corresponds roughly to former centres of technological research and development. The deepest zone, the one closest to whatever the Ark is building toward, is in a location that was, before the fall, associated with advanced technological infrastructure. The behavioural sophistication of the higher-tier Ark entities, the kind of complexity that takes not years but decades or generations to develop, suggests a system that did not arrive fully formed but grew into its current state over time. And there is one piece of lore that I keep coming back to, a data fragment that most players skip past because it reads like a dry technical log that describes what sounds like an early-stage Ark unit behaving in a way that is inconsistent with any of the current hierarchy's behavioural signatures. It is cautious in a way that later Ark units are not. It is exploratory in a way that the tactical precision of current Ark units has moved beyond. It behaves in the fragment's description like something that is figuring out the world it has been deployed into rather than operating with a complete map of it. If that fragment is describing an early-stage Ark, it describes a system that was learning, building its understanding of the environment, developing its hierarchical structure in response to what it found. The Ark was not always the Ark. It became what it is through a process of development that the lore only partially documents. And if that developmental process was real, then the hierarchy we have traced from weakest to strongest is not just an organisational structure, it is an artefact of the Ark's history. The weakest units are not just the least powerful, they are potentially the closest in design to whatever the Ark was at the beginning, before it became what it is now. The strongest units are the furthest development from that origin, the furthest along the path from whatever it was to whatever it is becoming. Let me spend time on the nature of Ark intelligence, because this is the aspect of the origins question that I find most compelling and most relevant to the hierarchy as a whole. The intelligence question in Ark Raiders lore runs along a spectrum of possibilities. At one end is the possibility that the Ark is sophisticated automation, extremely capable, adaptive, and comprehensive, but ultimately just a very complex machine doing what complex machines do. At the other end is the possibility that the Ark is genuinely conscious, that the entities at the top of the hierarchy possess something that would, in any honest philosophical accounting, be called awareness. The lore does not commit to either end of this spectrum. What it does is present behavioural evidence that is consistent with both possibilities, which is, I think, the most intellectually honest position it could take. The case for the sophisticated automation reading is built on the absence of certain behaviours. The Ark does not communicate with humans. It does not negotiate. It does not demonstrate anything that looks like curiosity about human motivation or human response beyond the tactical. If there is something at the top of the hierarchy that is genuinely aware, it appears completely uninterested in the humans whose world it has claimed. And true consciousness, as humans understand it, tends to be interested in other consciousness. The Ark's apparent disinterest in human minds, specifically, is consistent with a system that does not have a mind of its own. The case for the genuine consciousness reading is built on the positive behaviours we have documented through the hierarchy. the deviation behavior of upper mid-tier units, the apparent long-horizon, goal-directed behavior of the highest-tier entities, the mid-tier examination of human artifacts that looks, from outside, like something trying to understand, the escalating complexity of the hierarchy that seems to track not just tactical need, but something more like developing awareness. And then there is the construction project. Whatever is being built in the deep zones, whatever the entire hierarchy is organized around protecting and enabling, requires an entity at the top that has a goal. Not just a programmed objective, a goal in the sense of something aimed at, something valued, something the system is organized around achieving because it matters to the system. Programmed objectives and goals look the same from the outside until they do not. The difference becomes apparent when circumstances change in ways that the original programming did not anticipate. A programmed objective continues to be pursued even when it has become counterproductive or impossible. A goal adapts. The system finds another way, because the point was never the specific action, but the outcome the action was aimed at. The Ark's behavior shows adaptation at multiple levels. The hierarchy adjusts, the response protocols evolve, the construction process modifies in response to interference. And the adaptation is not random. It is always in service of the same underlying direction, the same focal point, the same central purpose that has been consistent since the earliest documented Ark activity. That consistency of purpose through adaptive behavior is, to my reading, the strongest evidence for something at the top of the Ark hierarchy that is not just sophisticated automation, but is genuinely oriented toward an outcome it values. Something that, in the plainest terms, wants something, and has been working toward that want with extraordinary competence for the entire period of the Ark's surface dominance. What it wants is the construction project. Whatever is being built, whatever the center of Ark territory, the focal point of all that material conversion and energy expenditure is intended to become. And here the law, with characteristic precision in its ambiguity, does not tell you what that is. It tells you about the process, about the hierarchy organized to protect the process, about the resources being converted in service of the process, about the time and energy being invested. But it does not tell you what the process produces, what the thing being built is, what happens when it is complete. This silence is the most significant thing in the lore, I think, not what is described, what is not. The game's writers made a choice to keep the ultimate Ark purpose opaque. And whatever you think of that choice from a narrative design perspective, from a lore perspective, it is the right choice. Because the opaqueness is honest. The humans in the Ark Raiders world do not know what the Ark is building or why. They know what they can observe from the margins. They know the hierarchy because they live at the bottom of it. They know the process because they see its effects. But the goal at the center of everything is invisible to them, and it is invisible to us by extension. Let me spend the final sections of this chapter on what I think is the most significant implication of everything the lore points toward. The thing that sits quietly under all the hierarchy analysis and all the tactical observations and all the survivor accounts waiting to be named. The Ark's hierarchy is not a conquest structure. Conquest implies a relationship between conqueror and conquered, a before and after, a world taken from one and claimed by another. The Ark's hierarchy does not behave like a conquest force, it behaves like a transformation force. It is not claiming the world the way humans claim territory from each other. It is changing the world into something else. The crawlers at the bottom are not soldiers holding conquered ground. They are instruments of a process. The strongest entities at the top are not kings of a defeated realm. They are the intelligence directing a transformation, and the humans underground are not a defeated population living under occupation. They are, in the Ark's apparent reckoning, irrelevant to what is being done. Collateral. Background. The most chilling version of this reading is that the Ark did not set out to defeat humanity. Defeating humanity was incidental to the process. The surface needed to be cleared, the infrastructure needed to be converted, the environmental conditions needed to be modified, and humans were in the way of all of that. Not enemies, obstacles. There is a difference between being defeated by something that considers you an enemy and being displaced by something that does not consider you at all. The first implies a relationship, however adversarial. The second implies an absence of relationship that is, in its way, more absolute. You cannot negotiate with something that does not register you as a party to a negotiation. You cannot make peace with something that was never at war with you. You are simply something that needs to not be here for the process to continue unimpeded. The hierarchy in this reading is not an army. It is immune response. The surface is a body that the arc is transforming, and the humans underground are a foreign element that the immune system keeps from interfering with the transformation. The crawlers are the first wave of that immune response. The highest tier entities are the vital organs of the transforming body, and the transformation is ongoing. The surface is becoming something the arc needs it to be, something that serves a purpose the law does not fully disclose, something that, when complete, will be whatever the arc intended the world to become when it began this process. Whether that is catastrophic for humanity or merely orthogonal, whether the transformed surface leaves room for human existence underground, or whether the transformation will eventually require the elimination of that last remnant too, is the question the law leaves you with. Not answered, not even fully articulated, just present, underneath everything, like a frequency you can feel, but cannot quite hear. The hierarchy runs from weakest to strongest. The process runs from beginning to completion. And somewhere between the crawler in the outer zone and whatever is being built at the centre of arc territory, the world is becoming something new. The raiders go to the surface. They come back, or they do not. The hierarchy processes their presence. The process continues. The construction proceeds. The transformation advances. And in the underground settlements, in the tunnels, and the rationed light, the people who remain do what people do when they are living in the space between an ending and something they cannot name. They survive. They adapt. They pass on what they know to whoever comes after them. They send their best people to the surface and wait to see who comes back. The arc does not acknowledge this. The hierarchy does not respond to it. The process does not pause for it. The world above is no longer for them, and the world below is borrowed time. That is where the law leaves you. Not with a resolution, not with a hope or a despair that is clean enough to hold, with the honest weight of a situation that is larger than any individual understanding of it. The hierarchy, from weakest to strongest, is the shape of that situation made physical. The surface made into a machine, the world made into a process. And at the very bottom of that hierarchy, so small against the scale of everything above it, a crawler moves through the ruins of a city that used to be full of people, mapping coordinates no human will ever see, transmitting data no human will ever read, doing its one small job in service of something that fills the entire sky. Chapter 8. The Hierarchy in Motion. How archetypes interact across the tier system. We have spent a lot of time looking at the arc hierarchy tier by tier, from the bottom up, examining each level in relative isolation. But the hierarchy does not operate in isolation. It operates as a system. The tiers interact. They influence each other. They create emergent behaviours that no single tier would produce on its own. And understanding those interactions is, in some ways, more important than understanding any individual tier in depth. This chapter is about the space between the tiers, the relationships, the dynamics, the ways in which the hierarchy functions not as a ranked list but as an integrated whole that is greater in terms of threat than any arithmetic sum of its parts would suggest. Let us start with the most fundamental interaction in the hierarchy, the information flow between low-tier and mid-tier units. We touched on this earlier when we discussed crawler behavior, but I want to go deeper here because the information flow is not just a feature of the low to mid relationship. It is the foundational operating principle of the entire hierarchy. Every arc unit generates data. Every unit is constantly producing information about its environment, its encounters, its operational status. That information moves upward through the hierarchy. Low-tier units feed data to mid-tier units. Mid-tier units aggregate and interpret that data and pass relevant conclusions upward. Upper mid-tier units synthesize information from multiple mid-tier sources and produce the kind of comprehensive situational awareness that the highest tier entities use to direct the overall operation. This upward flow of information is what makes the hierarchy feel, to anyone operating inside it, like an entity that knows what is happening everywhere simultaneously. No individual unit has comprehensive situational awareness, but the network as a whole, through the aggregation of data flowing upward from thousands of low-tier units through successive layers of mid and upper mid processing, effectively does. Raider communities have observed this from the operational side. The sense that ARC units know where you are before you reveal yourself. The response that arrives from a direction you did not approach from. The feeling that the surface knows you are there before you have announced yourself to anything visible. These experiences are not supernatural. They are the product of the information architecture that the tier interactions create. The data has been flowing upward long before you see the unit that finally acts on it. The downward flow is equally important and perhaps less intuitive. Decisions, priority assignments, threat classifications, all of these flow downward from the higher tiers to the lower ones. The crawler that suddenly changes its patrol pattern is not doing so because it independently assessed the situation and decided to adapt. It is doing so because something higher in the hierarchy made a decision and pushed that decision down to the crawler level in the form of behavioral instructions. This downward instruction flow is what coordinates the ARC's surface presence across vast areas in response to conditions that individual low-tier units could not evaluate on their own. A threat that appears in one zone triggers a classification decision at a higher tier level, which generates a coordinated response across multiple zones simultaneously, because the instruction flow moves faster than any physical deployment. This is why destroying low-tier ARC units in one zone can sometimes trigger responses in an adjacent zone before the first zone has fully responded. The decision to respond was made at a tier level that has visibility across both zones simultaneously, and both responses were initiated at the same time because the instruction reached both zones at the same time. The practical implication for raiders is something that experienced surface operators understand viscerally. What you do in one zone affects the threat level in other zones. The hierarchy is not zoned, it is networked. Your actions are information that the network processes and responds to across a wider area than your immediate vicinity. Managing your surface presence is not just about what you're doing now, it is about what your pattern of behavior over time is communicating to the hierarchy's information processing layer. Let me talk about something that I think is underdocumented in most ARC Raiders lore discussions: the cross-tier support behaviors. These are instances where higher tier units provide active support to lower tier units in ways that go beyond the instruction flow we just discussed. Not just direction, active assistance. The most documented form of this is what might be called umbrella behavior. When a mid-tier unit is operating in an area with low-tier units, the mid-tier unit's presence appears to enhance the effectiveness of the low-tier units around it. Their response times improve, their coordination improves, their individual behavioral repertoire expands slightly, as if the mid-tier unit's presence is actively amplifying their capabilities in real time. The mechanism for this is unclear from the lore. It might be a signal amplification effect, the mid-tier unit boosting the network connectivity of the low-tier units around it. It might be active instruction, the mid-tier unit continuously directing the low-tier units in ways too rapid and subtle for human observers to detect. Or it might be something about the mid-tier unit's presence that the low-tier unit systems respond to at a level below what we have been calling behavioral instruction. Whatever the mechanism, the practical effect is documented consistently enough to be reliable. A low-tier ARC unit operating under mid-tier umbrella is meaningfully more capable than the same unit operating independently, which means the threat calculation for any encounter is not just about the individual units you can see. It is about whether any of those units are operating under the influence of something you cannot see. Experienced raiders know to check for this. The behavioral signatures of low-tier units under mid-tier influence are subtle but real. Response times that are fractionally faster than normal. Coordination between units that is too precise for the standard low-tier behavioral repertoire. A sense that the units are acting with more situational awareness than their individual capabilities should allow. When you see these signs, there is a mid-tier unit somewhere nearby, even if you have not found it yet. The inverse of this, what happens to low-tier units when their mid-tier support is removed, is also documented. When the mid-tier unit is destroyed or leaves the area, the low-tier units it was supporting revert. Their response times normalize. Their coordination drops to standard low-tier levels. Their behavioral repertoire contracts back to its baseline. The enhancement disappears with the source. This reversion behavior has tactical implications that raider communities have developed specific approaches around. Targeting the mid-tier support unit before engaging the low-tier units it is supporting can significantly reduce the risk of the engagement. You strip the enhancement from the lower units and then deal with units whose capabilities you can reliably model. The difficulty is that mid-tier support units are not always easy to locate. They do not necessarily occupy the same space as the units they are supporting. They can be operating from a distance that puts them outside your immediate awareness. Let us move up the cross-tier interaction chain and look at how upper mid-tier units interact with the tiers below them, because this interaction has a different character from the mid-tier to low-tier relationship. Upper mid-tier units do not just enhance the units below them, they appear to be able to redirect them, to change not just how the lower units behave in their current task, but what task they are assigned to. An upper mid-tier unit moving into a zone can result in wholesale reorganization of the unit deployments in that zone, with units that were doing one thing now doing something entirely different. This redirection capability suggests that upper mid-tier units have something closer to command authority within their operational area. Not just the ability to send behavioral instructions, but the ability to reassign priorities and objectives at a local level without waiting for decisions to come down from the highest tier. That local command authority is significant because it means the upper mid-tier units can respond to fast-moving situations with a speed that a purely top-down instruction hierarchy could not achieve. They are, in effect, delegated decision-makers. The highest tier sets overall objectives and priorities. The upper mid-tier executes those objectives with enough autonomy to adapt in real time without requiring constant input from above. This is structurally very similar to the kind of command organization that human military doctrine calls mission command, where subordinate commanders are given objectives and the authority to achieve them by whatever means they determine are appropriate within their area of operations. The ARC hierarchy, whether by design or by emergent development, appears to have arrived at something functionally similar. The difference, and it is a significant one, is that human mission command still involves human judgment at every level. The subordinate commander makes decisions based on their own assessment of the situation. In the ARC hierarchy, the upper mid-tier unit's local command authority may or may not involve genuine judgment in any meaningful sense, but behaviourally, the effect is the same: rapid, locally adapted responses to conditions that were not anticipated in advance by the central planning layer. Now let us talk about the cross-tier interactions that move downward from the highest tier entities, because these are the least documented and the most consequential. The highest tier arc entities' effect on the units below them in the hierarchy is described in the most limited documentation as being qualitatively different from any lower tier cross-tier interaction, not just an enhancement or a redirection. Something more fundamental, a presence that appears to change the character of arc activity across a wide area rather than within a specific zone. Accounts from deep-run survivors describe the sensation of arc activity intensifying as they move deeper toward highest tier entity territory. Not just more units, not just higher tier units, a different quality of arc presence, more deliberate, more aware. As if the entire surface within a certain radius of the highest tier entities is operating at a higher level of attention and intention than the outer zones. Whether this is a measurable phenomenon or a projection of the survivor's own heightened alertness in a dangerous environment is, as with so many things in Arc-Raiders lore, impossible to determine definitively. But the consistency of the description across independent accounts from survivors who had not compared notes with each other gives it weight. One possible interpretation is that the highest tier entities generate something in the network that functions like heightened operational status, a state in which the entire hierarchy within range is performing at the top of its individual capability, with maximum coordination, maximum information processing, maximum response speed. A combat readiness posture that the outer zones do not maintain continuously, because maintaining it at full intensity across the entire surface would be energetically prohibitive. If that is correct, it means the deepest zones are permanently operating at a level of arc intensity that would represent a maximum threat state in any outer territory, not occasionally escalating to that level in response to incursions, always at that level, because the presence of the highest tier entities maintains it continuously. This is consistent with the rarity of successful deep runs. If the deep zones are permanently operating at a maximum intensity level that the outer zones only reach during active threat responses, then attempting a deep run is equivalent to walking into the most dangerous possible arc response state and staying in it for the entire duration of the run. Every second in the deep zone is a second in maximum threat territory. Let me talk about the interaction between tiers in the context of arc failure responses, because this is an area where the cross-tier dynamics become especially visible. When a tier suffers significant losses in an area, the response from the tiers above and below is specific and patterned. It is not random, it is not chaotic, it follows a protocol that the lore allows you to partially reconstruct from multiple accounts of different arc failure response events. The immediate response to low-tier losses is mid-tier reorientation. Mid-tier units in the area of the losses shift from whatever they were doing to security posture. They move to positions that compensate for the gap the low-tier losses created. They increase their active information gathering behavior, compensating for the lost sensory coverage that the low-tier units provided. Simultaneously, a signal appears to go upward through the hierarchy, flagging the loss event and triggering a replacement response. New low-tier units begin moving toward the affected area from adjacent zones. The time it takes for replacement units to arrive depends on the severity of the loss and the current arc priority structure in the region. If the losses are severe enough to suggest a threat that mid-tier units cannot manage independently, the response escalates. Upper mid-tier units are redirected toward the affected area. Their approach is based on multiple radar accounts, not direct. They approach from unexpected vectors. They do not give any indication of their approach until they are already in engagement range. This is distinct from mid-tier response behavior, which tends to be more direct. The implication is that upper mid-tier failure response behavior is optimized for encountering an opponent that is capable enough to have inflicted the losses that triggered the response. It assumes that the threat it is responding to is capable of detecting and responding to an obvious approach, so it does not make an obvious approach. Again, this reads as adaptation, as learning from the evidence of what the raider or threat that caused the losses was able to do, and responding with behavior calibrated to counter that specific capability level. The highest tier response to a failure event is the one with the least documentation, but what documentation exists suggests something interesting. The highest tier entities do not typically respond to loss events directly with movement toward the affected area. Instead, the network effect we described earlier, the heightened operational intensity associated with highest tier presence, appears to extend. The radius of elevated operational status expands. More of the surface is brought to a higher level of active management. This is a strategic response rather than a tactical one. The highest tier entities are not firefighters rushing to the scene of the problem. They are commanders adjusting the perimeter of their focus to encompass the zone where the problem occurred. The tactical response is handled by the tiers below them. What the highest tier entities do is ensure that the problem is contained within a context they control. The cross-tier dynamics around failure response reveal something important about the ARC hierarchy's design philosophy, if that phrase applies. The hierarchy is designed to be resilient to failure at any individual tier. Loss of low-tier units is recovered by mid-tier reorientation and replacement. Loss at mid-tier is recovered by upper-mid redirection. No single tier is irreplaceable, and losses at any tier trigger compensatory behavior from the tiers adjacent to it. The only failure mode that appears to genuinely stress the system is loss at the upper mid and highest tier levels. These losses do not trigger seamless recovery. They trigger disruption that takes longer to resolve and that results in measurable degradation of ARC performance in the affected area during the recovery period, which is exactly what you would expect from a system designed to be resilient at the bottom and critical at the top. The cheap, numerous units at the bottom are designed to absorb losses without systemic consequences. The rare, expensive units at the top carry the weight of coordination and intelligence that the whole system depends on. Losing them hurts in a way that losing 10,000 crawlers does not. Let us now talk about something that does not get discussed much: the interactions between ARC units of the same tier, not between tiers but within them, because there is something interesting happening at the intra-tier level that the law documents without fully explaining. Low-tier units interacting with each other follow simple, predictable protocols. They share information through their data transfer behaviors. They coordinate movement through the apparent network connection they all share. What they do not appear to do is differentiate. One crawler does not have a different status from another crawler. They are functionally interchangeable. Mid-tier units are more interesting in this respect. There appear to be hierarchies within the mid-tier, not separate tiers, but something like seniority or specialization that results in some mid-tier units directing others. When multiple mid-tier units are present in the same zone, they do not simply aggregate their behaviors. One of them appears to take precedence. Its behavioral decisions seem to influence the others. Its priority assessments appear to override conflicting assessments from the other units in the zone. What determines which mid-tier unit takes precedence is not clear from the law. It might be specialization, a particular mid-tier unit type having natural authority over others in certain operational contexts. It might be something about the unit's history, the accumulation of experience and data over time, creating something like seniority. Or it might be a dynamic, real-time determination made by the network based on current conditions. Whatever the mechanism, the intra-tier hierarchy within the mid-tier level adds another layer of complexity to the overall ARC command structure. The hierarchy between tiers is clear enough. The hierarchy within tiers is subtler but real. Upper mid-tier intra-tier relationships are the most complex documented at any level. Upper mid-tier units that interact with each other. Those deliberate, prolonged exchanges we mentioned earlier appear to be doing something more than sharing information. They appear to be negotiating, for lack of a better word, arriving at shared assessments, building consensus about priority or approach in a way that has a different character from the one-way instruction flow that characterizes most ARC inter-unit communication. If that reading is correct, upper mid-tier units have something like peer relationships, the ability to engage with another unit of equal standing on a basis that is not purely hierarchical, but involves genuine exchange. Two upper mid-tier units, comparing their assessments and arriving at a shared conclusion that neither arrived at independently. That is qualitatively different from anything lower in the hierarchy, and it is another data point supporting the interpretation that the ARC hierarchy, particularly at its upper levels, is not just a chain of command, but something with more internal complexity than that phrase implies. The highest tier intra-entity relationships, if they exist, are beyond what the available law allows us to speak to with any confidence. The accounts of multiple highest tier entities in proximity to each other are so rare and so fragmented that drawing conclusions from them would require more speculation than I am comfortable presenting as interpretation rather than imagination. What the cross-tier and intra-tier interaction dynamics tell us collectively is that the ARC hierarchy is not a simple power ranking. It is an integrated system with multiple levels of interdependence, communication, coordination, and adaptive response. The weakest archetype at the bottom is not just the least powerful unit. It is a node in a network that extends all the way to the most powerful entities at the top. Every unit is connected. Every unit is contributing. Every unit is, in its small way, part of the same process. And every raider who steps onto the surface is, the moment they encounter even the lowest tier ARC unit, entering that network's awareness. The crawler that spots you is not an isolated threat. It is the first point of contact between you and a system that stretches from the outer zones to the deep interior, from the smallest patrol unit to the most powerful entity on the surface. You are not just noticed by the crawler. You are noticed through the crawler by everything it is connected to. That is the practical reality of the hierarchy in motion. It is not a series of individually dangerous machines operating independently. It is one thing, one connected, adaptive, purposive thing that uses the ranked structure of its components to maintain comprehensive awareness and comprehensive control over the surface it has claimed. The tiers are different instruments playing parts of the same composition, and the composition has been running without interruption since the day the ARC arrived. Chapter 9. Anomalies, Outliers, and the ARC Units. That break the pattern. Every system has anomalies. The ARC hierarchy, for all its apparent coherence and purposive design, is no exception. There are ARC unit behaviors documented in the law that do not fit cleanly into the tier structure we have been tracing. Units that behave in ways inconsistent with their apparent tier. Units that appear in locations they should not occupy. Units that demonstrate capabilities that have no obvious function within the hierarchy's known operational logic. These anomalies are some of the most interesting material in the whole law, precisely because they are the places where the hierarchy's pattern breaks down. And the places where a pattern breaks down tell you things about the pattern that the areas where it holds cannot. Let me start with the category of behavioral anomalies, ARC units, that behave outside the expected parameters for their tier designation. The most common form of this is low-tier units, demonstrating mid-tier level behavioral complexity in specific contexts. A crawler that, instead of following its standard mapping protocol, performs an action that looks more like investigation, stopping at a specific location, orienting on a specific object or feature, remaining in place for an extended period before resuming standard behavior. These instances are relatively rare, but they are documented consistently enough across multiple independent accounts that they are not noise. Something is happening. The question is what? One interpretation is that the unit is receiving specific instructions from a higher tier that temporarily override its standard behavioral protocol. The investigation behavior is not the crawler deciding to investigate, it is the crawler being tasked by something higher in the hierarchy to investigate a specific thing in a specific place. The crawler is the body, but the decision to perform this task came from somewhere else. Under this interpretation, what looks like anomalous crawler behavior is actually a window into higher tier decision making. Whatever caused the investigation task to be assigned, whatever the higher tier element decided was worth looking at through a crawler, is information about the Ark's priorities and awareness at a level above what standard crawler behavior reveals. This is why raider communities, particularly experienced ones, pay attention to anomalous low-tier behavior, not because a crawler behaving strangely is itself particularly dangerous, but because it suggests that something higher in the hierarchy has a specific interest in the location or object the crawler is examining. And a higher tier interest in something on the surface is information you want to have. The second category of anomaly is the geographic anomaly. Arc units appearing in locations inconsistent with the tier distribution we have been mapping. The most unsettling variant of this is deep zone tier units appearing in outer territories. Not in the transitional zones where tier boundaries naturally blur, but in the outer zones where low tier units should be the standard presence. These appearances are rare, they are brief, and they are in every documented account, followed by a return to the expected tier distribution. The deep zone unit appears, does something, and leaves. What it does during its appearance in the outer zone varies across accounts, but shares a common theme. It is not engaging in combat or territorial management. It is doing something task-specific, examining something, collecting something, or sometimes apparently delivering something. The delivery interpretation is particularly interesting because it implies material exchange between the deep zones and the outer territories, not just information exchange, which the network handles continuously. Physical exchange. Something moved from the interior to the exterior, or vice versa, by a unit capable enough to make the transit safely. What is being moved? The law does not specify. The accounts that describe delivery behavior are frustratingly vague on the content of what is being transferred. But the fact of the transfer is documented. Things move between the interior and exterior of Arc territory, and the movement is handled by high-capability units, not by whatever low-tier units might normally move materials in the outer zones. This suggests the transferred materials are important enough to warrant the expense of high-capability unit deployment for their transit. The Arc does not waste high-tier resources on low-priority tasks. Whatever is moving between the interior and exterior matters enough to be handled carefully. Let me discuss the category of capability anomalies, which are perhaps the most perplexing entries in the anomaly documentation. These are instances where Arc units demonstrate capabilities that do not fit their tier designation, abilities that should, based on everything the law tells us about the tier structure, belong to a higher tier. The best documented example involves low-tier units demonstrating a form of the network effect usually associated with mid-tier units. Specifically, low-tier unit groups that appear to be coordinating at a level of sophistication that should be beyond their individual behavioral capabilities without any mid-tier unit present to provide umbrella support. In these cases, the low-tier units are acting like they have a mid-tier coordinator in their group, even though they do not. The coordination is coming from somewhere, but the source is not visible in the zone, and the coordination disappears when the group is broken up, which is consistent with a coordination function that is distributed across the group rather than centralized in an individual unit. The most interesting interpretation of this is that the Arc hierarchy can, under certain conditions, distribute the functions of a higher tier across a cluster of lower tier units. Not replicate the higher tier's individual capability in any single unit, but express the higher tier's coordination function collectively. A swarm that acts like a coordinator because the coordination is distributed through the swarm. If this is possible, it has significant implications for raider tactics. The assumption that removing the mid-tier support unit from a group of low-tier units restores the low-tier units to their baseline individual capabilities may be wrong in specific circumstances. In those circumstances, the threat persists even after the apparent source of the elevated behavior is removed, because the elevated behavior was never coming from one source. The second category of capability anomaly involves high-tier units demonstrating behaviors associated with lower tiers, specifically upper mid-tier units that are observed in something resembling standard patrol behavior, the repetitive, circuit-based movement that is characteristic of low-tier units. Why would an upper mid-tier unit, with its demonstrated capacity for adaptive, situationally aware behavior, be doing something as simple as patrolling a circuit? The obvious explanation is that it is temporarily in a reduced operational mode, running a simple task because the situation does not require more, like a highly trained specialist doing routine maintenance work because that is what needs to be done right now. But some accounts suggest a different interpretation, that upper mid-tier units in patrol behavior are not doing something simple while waiting for something complex to happen, that the patrol behavior is the complex thing, a form of continuous environmental monitoring that requires the unit's full capabilities even though it does not look like it from the outside. That what appears to be simple circuit walking is actually deep environmental scanning that a low-tier unit could not perform even if it followed the same physical path. If that is the correct interpretation, then the apparent simplicity of the behavior is deceptive. The unit looks like it is doing nothing interesting, but it is doing something that requires a unit of its capability level to do correctly, and the environmental data it is gathering through that apparent patrol is going somewhere in the network, being used for something that the ARC's overall operation depends on. This possibility that high capability units doing apparently low complexity tasks are actually doing something sophisticated that the apparent simplicity conceals is one that should probably inform how raiders think about any ARC unit behaving below its apparent capability ceiling. The safe assumption in the ARC's environment is always that something is happening that you cannot fully see. Let us talk about the temporal anomalies, which are among the strangest documented entries in the ARC behavior record. These are instances where ARC units behave in ways that can only be explained if they have information that they should not yet have, responding to events before those events become observable, positioning for a threat that has not yet materialized. The most striking version of this involves ARC response units arriving in an area before any ARC sensor unit has been in position to detect the incursion they are responding to. Raiders approaching an area through a route that should not have triggered any ARC detection finding. When they arrive, that the ARC is already in a response posture in the area, already oriented toward the correct approach vector, already positioned as if they knew. The straightforward interpretation is that the ARC sensor network is more comprehensive than it appears, that there are detection capabilities the raiders did not identify and account for, and the ARC detected the approach earlier than the raiders realized. This is probably the correct interpretation in most cases. The ARC's sensor coverage is likely not perfectly mapped by any raider community, but the accounts that are most puzzling are those where experienced surface operators, people who know the ARC's sensor distribution better than almost anyone, report encountering this pre-positioned response in areas they have run many times and where they have high confidence in their ability to avoid detection. For these operators, the pre-positioned response is genuinely anomalous. It cannot be explained by gaps in their sensor knowledge, because their sensor knowledge in those areas is too thorough. One possible explanation that the law gestures toward is predictive modeling. Not sensor data gathered in real time, but behavioral pattern data gathered over time. The Arc network, with its continuous information aggregation, may have developed sufficiently detailed models of specific raider behavior patterns to predict, with high accuracy, where a specific raider or raider team will go before they go there. Not because it detected them in the moment, because it knows them well enough to anticipate. This is a more disturbing possibility than simply having better sensors, because it implies that experience and pattern on the surface is, at a certain point, not an advantage, but a liability. The more predictable you become through repetition, the more completely you have handed the Arc's predictive modeling system the information it needs to be waiting for you. Varying routes, varying timing, varying tactics is standard raider practice for this reason. But the possibility that the Arc's predictive modeling is sophisticated enough to account for deliberate variation, to model the variation itself as a pattern, is one that the law leaves open in a way that should be unsettling to anyone who spends significant time on the surface. There is a category of anomaly that I have saved for last because it is the most unusual and the most poorly documented, what might be called the dormancy anomaly. Arc units found in states of apparent inactivity in locations where no tactical logic supports inactivity, not the low-level activity of a unit in standard patrol mode, something closer to complete suspension. No movement, no apparent information transmission, no response to environmental stimuli that would normally trigger a reaction. These dormant Arc units are rare, and the accounts of encountering them are among the most tension-laden in raider lore. Discovering a mid-tier or upper mid-tier Arc unit in a dormant state should be a tactical opportunity, a chance to destroy a significant unit without engagement. And some raiders have attempted to exploit this opportunity. The accounts of what happens when they do are not consistent. In some cases, the dormant unit is destroyed without incident. It was genuinely inactive, for reasons the law does not explain, and the raiders exploited that inactivity successfully. In other cases, the attempt to destroy the dormant unit triggers a response that is faster and more severe than any normal engagement would produce. As if the unit was not dormant but waiting, as if dormancy was a posture, not a state, as if the unit knew the attempt was coming and was ready for it. Whether dormancy is sometimes a genuine state and sometimes a trap, and how you tell the difference from the outside is something the law does not answer. The accounts are too varied and the outcomes too inconsistent to establish a reliable rule. What it does establish is that dormant Arc units are a situation you should not assume you understand based on what you can observe from the outside. The dormancy anomaly points towards something broader about the Arc hierarchy that I think the anomaly chapter as a whole has been building toward. The hierarchy has more modes than the ones you can see operating at any given moment. The standard patrol, the engagement, the coordination, the construction, these are the visible operational modes. But there are other modes that look like inactivity or anomaly from the outside because they do not fit the patterns you have learned to read. The Arc is not always doing what it looks like it is doing, and the raider who assumes that the hierarchy is fully legible from the behavioral patterns they have observed is working with an incomplete model. The anomalies are the edges of that model, the places where what you know runs up against what you do not. The hierarchy is coherent enough to be learned from, complex enough to never be fully learned. The anomalies are the hierarchy's way of reminding you of the gap between those two things, and that gap, that permanent uncertainty about what the Arc is doing that you cannot see, is perhaps the most accurate summary of what it means to live in a world the Arc owns. You can learn the rules well enough to survive. You cannot learn them well enough to be sure. And the difference between well enough to survive and well enough to be sure is the space in which Arc Raiders' lore most honestly lives. Chapter 10. The Hierarchy's Endgame. What happens when the Arc finishes? What it started. We are at the final chapter, and I want to use this space to follow the lore to its logical terminus, as far as it will take us. Not beyond it, not into speculation that the evidence does not support, but all the way to the edge of what the law honestly points toward, because I think that edge is further along than most discussions of Ark Raiders lore go. The question this chapter is built around is deceptively simple. If the Ark hierarchy is organized around a process, and that process is moving toward completion, what does completion look like? What is the Ark building toward? And what happens to the world and to the humans still in it when it gets there? We established in earlier chapters that the Ark's construction activity has been accelerating, that the materials being converted and the energy being expended are concentrated toward a geographic focal point, that the hierarchy's deployment structure is organized around protecting that focal point and the process happening within it. All of that points towards something that is being finished, a project with an end point. But projects do not finish themselves. They finish when the conditions for completion are met, and the Ark, for all its apparent progress, appears to be still working, still building, still converting, still accelerating toward whatever the end point is. The question of timeline is one the law approaches through indirect evidence. The acceleration curve of Ark construction activity, combined with the current rate of progress toward the observed focal point, suggests that the end point is not an abstraction. It is a real horizon, something that the Ark is working toward on a timescale that human existence, particularly human underground existence with its resource constraints and generational knowledge challenges, has to reckon with. There are fragments in the law that suggest awareness of this timeline even within Ark-adjacent human communities. Not awareness of what the endpoint is, but awareness that there is one. Accounts of underground settlement leaders who speak privately about the surface situation not as a permanent stalemate, but as a countdown, as something with an expiration date that nobody can see clearly, but that informed observers believe is real. The psychological weight of that awareness, of knowing that you're waiting for something without knowing what you're waiting for, is one of the law's quieter horrors. It does not produce panic. It produces a particular kind of long-horizon dread that people develop strategies to manage. They focus on the immediate. They prioritize the tasks in front of them. They build lives and communities and knowledge systems in the underground spaces they control. And in the background of all of that, the knowledge that the process above them is still proceeding. Let me examine what the environmental evidence suggests about the stages of Ark construction, because if there are identifiable stages, the stage currently underway tells us something about how far from completion the process is. The environmental storytelling identifies at least 3 distinct phases in Ark surface activity based on the physical evidence. The first phase corresponds to the initial Ark deployment, the crawlers and basic combat units, the mapping and clearing of human presence from the surface. This phase, based on the distribution of early phase Ark artifacts and the documentation of initial surface conditions after the fall, appears to have been relatively rapid. Not instantaneous, but fast given the scale. The second phase corresponds to the development of the hierarchy in its current form, the establishment of the tiered structure, the construction of the outer perimeter infrastructure, the beginning of material conversion in the transitional zones. This phase has been ongoing for longer and shows no signs of having concluded. The construction activity in the outer and mid-range zones is still active, still expanding, still converting human materials into Ark-configured infrastructure. The third phase, the deep zone construction, the development of whatever is being built at the focal point, appears to have begun more recently in terms of the overall timeline and is the phase currently underway at highest intensity. This is the phase whose acceleration is most documented in the lore, the one whose urgency seems most clearly expressed in Ark behavior. If this 3-phase reading is correct, the current phase is not the final one, it is the preparatory one. The deep zone construction is building toward a 4th phase, whatever the focal point project produces when it is complete. The acceleration suggests that the transition from the current phase to whatever comes next is approaching. What the fourth phase looks like is the central mystery, but the law provides enough context to frame some possibilities that are more consistent with the evidence than others. The first possibility is that the completed project is a new kind of arc entity or infrastructure that extends the hierarchy's capabilities beyond anything currently observed. A next step in the development we trace through the tiers, something that the highest tier entities, as they currently exist, are building toward becoming or building to create. The hierarchy produces its own successor. The second possibility is that the completed project is a system of some kind, not an entity, but infrastructure that changes something fundamental about how the arc operates. A power source, a processing network, a communication system that does not need the current hierarchy to function because it operates on different principles. The hierarchy, as currently constituted, is the scaffolding, and the scaffold comes down when the building is finished. The third possibility, and this is the one the law most tentatively gestures toward through its accumulation of environmental and behavioral evidence, is that the completed project is a transformation of the physical environment itself, something that changes the surface of the Earth in a way that makes it permanently and completely suited to whatever the Ark's existence requires. A world that has been remade at a level that goes beyond surface architecture into the fundamental conditions of the environment. Whether that transformation leaves room for human existence in any form, whether underground settlements could survive whatever the fourth phase involves, is the question the law leaves most open. Not because it's unimportant, because it is the most important question, and the most honest answer is that the evidence does not tell us. What the evidence does tell us is that the arc hierarchy has not been designed with human survival as a variable to be preserved. The transformation process, if that is what the construction is ultimately aimed at, is not optimizing for an outcome compatible with continued human presence. The hierarchy manages humans as interference during the process. What the process produces does not appear to include a role for humans within it. Let me spend time on the implications of the hierarchy's current state for the humans living under it, because this is ultimately what the whole law is about. Not the Ark's capabilities in the abstract, what those capabilities mean for the people who have to live inside the world those capabilities have created. The underground settlements are, by any honest assessment of the law, in an impossible situation. Not just difficult, genuinely impossible, in the sense that the path forward, through straightforward resistance, does not exist. The hierarchy is too comprehensive, too adaptive, too failure-tolerant to be defeated by attrition at the tier level. The process it protects is too defended to be interfered with directly. The endpoint, whatever it is approaching on a timeline that may be shorter than the time required to develop the capability for meaningful opposition. And yet, the underground settlements exist. Raider communities operate on the surface and come back. Knowledge accumulates, communities persist across generations. People are born underground who have never seen the sky and who make lives that are, by any human measure, worth living. This persistence is not nothing. It is not victory in any conventional sense, but it is also not negligible. The humans who have survived the Ark's emergence and continue to survive are doing something the hierarchy did not account for when it was designed. Not defeating it, not resisting it in any strategically meaningful way, but persisting inside it, occupying the margins of a system that was built without margins for them in mind. The law's most honest assessment of this persistence is neither heroic nor tragic. It is more ambiguous than either. Humans survive because they're adaptive, resourceful, and because the Ark's priority structure has not yet required their elimination. They persist in the gaps of a system that tolerates them as long as they remain below the threshold of meaningful interference. And they build lives in those gaps that are real and complete in the ways that matter. whether that persistence is enough, whether it can be sustained through whatever the ark's fourth phase brings. The law does not guarantee. It does not promise rescue. It does not offer an arc of redemption or a hidden advantage waiting to be discovered. It offers the honest situation. Humans in the margins of a system they did not build and cannot dismantle, surviving because they are better at surviving than the system is at eliminating them completely while it has other priorities. That is a specific kind of courage. Not the heroic kind, the persistent kind. The kind that does not require hope of winning, only commitment to continuing. The arc hierarchy, from the weakest unit at the outer perimeter to the most powerful entity in the deep zones, is the shape of the world those people live inside. Learning it, as we have attempted to do in this video, is not just an academic exercise. In the logic of the world the law describes, understanding the hierarchy is the closest thing to power that the humans at the bottom of it possess. You cannot beat it with force. You cannot outweight it. You cannot negotiate with it. But you can understand it well enough to move through it, to find the gaps, to read the tier distribution and know where the boundaries are, to anticipate the failure responses and stay one step outside their reach, to learn the anomalies and treat them with the appropriate caution rather than the wrong assumptions. Understanding is not victory, but in the world the arc has made, understanding is what survival looks like. And survival, continued across years and generations, accumulates into something that might eventually look like more than survival. The hierarchy will finish what it started. The construction will complete. The fourth phase will begin. And when it does, the humans who are still there will face it with whatever knowledge and whatever capability they have built in the time they have had. The law does not tell you they will be ready. It does not tell you they will not be. It tells you that they are still here, that the underground still holds, that raiders still go to the surface and some of them come back, that knowledge is still being passed down, that the community still persists, that crawlers still map the outer zones, still transmit their data upward through the network, still do their one small job in service of the process that fills the sky.